Maggie Aldrin slammed the ledger onto Cornelius Hatch's desk so hard the inkwell jumped and splattered black across his white cuffs. Her hands were shaking not from fear, not yet, but from 2 weeks of counting numbers that refused to add up, and one night, one terrible sleepless night, when they finally did. 43 families, 43 forged signatures, 43 plots of land taken. She looked up at the most powerful man in Harlan Creek, Wyoming, and said clearly, and without trembling, "You're going to hang for this." He smiled. "No, Miss Aldrin, you are." If you want to know how Maggie fights back against a man who owns the law, the bank, and half the territory, subscribe to this channel, and stay with me until the very last word. And drop a comment below, telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The office smelled like pipe tobacco and old money, and Cornelius Hatch sat behind his mahogany desk like a man who had never once been told no by anyone who stayed standing long enough to hear his answer. He was not a large man. That was the first thing Maggie had noticed when she arrived in Harlan Creek 3 weeks ago, that the most feared man in 2 counties was barely 5'7", with soft banker's hands and a gold watch chain that caught the morning light every time he breathed. But fear, she had learned working the books in St. Louis, was never about size. Fear was about leverage. And Hatch had leverage over everything and everyone within 50 miles of this town. He looked at the ledger she had thrown on his desk, and then he looked at her, and the smile that crossed his face was the worst kind. Patient practiced the smile of a man who had survived worse threats than one woman with an arithmetic certificate. "Sit down, Miss Aldrin," he said. "I'll stand. Suit yourself." He folded his hands on the desk. "Now, what exactly do you think you found?" 43 mortgage contracts with forged signatures, Maggie said. "Filed between January and October of this year. Every single one tied to parcels along the new rail corridor. You've been foreclosing on land that was never legally transferred to you, Mr. Hatch. You've been stealing from ranching families and using their land as collateral for a silver speculation venture you haven't disclosed to a single investor." She opened the ledger to a page she had marked with a strip of brown paper. "Would you like me to read the entries aloud, or do you already know which ones I mean?" Hatch said nothing for 3 seconds. Then he said, "Close the door." "It's already closed." "Then lock it." "No." He stood up slowly, the way men of power stand when they want you to feel the weight of the room shifting toward them. "Miss Aldrin, I hired you to replace Gerald Foss, who died of a heart attack at this very desk 3 weeks ago. I paid your travel from St. Louis. I arranged your accommodations at Mrs. Crane's boarding house. I gave you access to records that I did not have to give you access to. You gave me access because you needed a certified accountant to sign off on the quarterly statements so your investors wouldn't ask questions," Maggie said. "You chose me because you assumed a woman from out of town would be too grateful for the work to look too closely at the numbers. You made a mistake, Mr. Hatch." The smile thinned but didn't disappear. "I made a mistake believing you were intelligent enough to understand your own situation." He came around the desk slowly. "You are a single woman, Miss Aldrin. No family in Wyoming. No connections in this territory. No one here who knows your name except the people I introduced you to." He stopped 6 feet away. "Now, I'm going to ask you one time politely to set down that ledger. I'm going to give you 2 weeks severance, a letter of reference, and a train ticket back to Missouri. And this conversation will have never happened." Maggie's heart was hammering against her ribs. She could feel it the way you feel a clock ticking in a very quiet room. But her voice when she spoke did not shake. "Those 43 families," she said. "Some of them have been on their land for 15 years. The Hendersons have 4 children. The Bautistas have a grandmother who can't travel. The McCready family just finished building a barn last spring." She looked at him directly. "Did you shake their hands before you forged their names?" Something moved across Hatch's face, then quick, involuntary gone in an instant. Not guilt exactly. Something older and darker than guilt. She had seen that look once before on her father's face 3 days before the St. Louis bank sent men to the door. "You have until tomorrow morning," Hatch said. "Leave the ledger on this desk. Be on the 7 o'clock train." He picked up the document she had thrown open and closed it with one flat, deliberate motion. "Or I'll see to it that you never work in any territory west of the Mississippi. I will write letters to every accounting firm, every land office, every trading company that might consider hiring a woman with your credentials. I will describe you as a thief and a forger, Miss Aldrin. And everyone in this town will confirm it, because everyone in this town does what I tell them." Maggie picked up the ledger. She tucked it under her arm. She looked at Cornelius Hatch for 5 full seconds. "You should know," she said quietly, "that I made copies." She walked out of his office through the front door of Harlan Creek Savings and Land Trust and into the cold December air of Wyoming Territory. Behind her, she heard Hatch say something to his clerk, his voice low and sharp. She did not look back. The main street of Harlan Creek was 40 yards of frozen mudboard sidewalks, and people who went suddenly quiet when they saw her come through that door. Word moved fast in small towns, and Harlan Creek was no exception. By the time she had taken 10 steps, she could see it on their faces. The downward glance, the deliberate turning away, the woman who pulled her child back by the shoulder, like Maggie was something contagious. Sheriff Carl Duvall was waiting at the end of the sidewalk. He was a big man, Duvall, not the kind of big that earned respect, but the kind that enforced it. He had a deputy on either side of him, and an expression of profound boredom that Maggie recognized immediately as performance. "Miss Aldrin," he said. "Sheriff, Mr. Hatch tells me you took something that belongs to him." Maggie stopped walking. She looked at the 3 men in front of her, and then at the people who had stopped to watch from a careful distance, and then back at Duvall. "Mr. Hatch hired me to review his accounts," she said. "Everything I have is a record I was authorized to access in the course of my employment. He says you removed documents without permission." "He's lying." Duvall's bored expression flickered. No one talked to him that way on the main street. Not women, not strangers, not anybody who wanted to keep their accommodations at Mrs. Crane's boarding house and their passage on the morning train. "Ma'am," he said, heavy and deliberate, "I'm going to need you to hand over whatever you took from that office. You're going to need a court order and a judge who doesn't owe Cornelius Hatch money," Maggie said. "Do you have one of those, Sheriff?" The silence that followed was the particular silence of a crowd that wants to help and won't. Maggie had grown up in that silence. She knew its weight. She knew the way people stood inside it, pressed flat against it, hoping someone else would be the first to speak so they wouldn't have to. Nobody spoke. Duvall reached out and took her arm. Not violently, just firmly, with the casual authority of a man who had never had to ask twice. "Come with me, Miss Aldrin. We can settle this at my office. Take your hand off her." The voice came from the left, from the direction of the livery stable, and it was the kind of voice that cut through cold air without being raised. Maggie turned. Caleb Dunmore stood on the edge of the board sidewalk with his hat pushed back and his hands loose at his sides, and an expression on his face that she could not immediately read. He was looking at Duvall, not at her. Duvall looked over slowly. "Dunmore, this isn't your business." "It is now." He stepped down off the sidewalk into the street. "I said take your hand off her." "She stole documents from—" "I heard what you said. I also heard what she said." Caleb looked at Maggie once briefly, and something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't name. Then he looked back at Duvall. "You got a court order, a warrant? Any piece of paper that says you can put your hands on a woman in the middle of the street because Hatch told you to?" Duvall's jaw tightened. "Dunmore." "Because if you don't," Caleb said, "then you're not enforcing the law. You're just doing what he pays you to do. And the difference matters. Even here." The deputy on the left shifted his weight. Duvall's hand loosened very slightly on Maggie's arm. She pulled free, Not dramatically, just a clean pull, and stepped back. Her heart was still hammering. She kept her face still. Duval looked at Caleb for a long moment. Then he looked at the crowd watching from the sidewalks and doorways. Then he said, "This isn't finished," and walked back toward his office with his deputies trailing behind him. Maggie stood in the middle of the frozen street with the ledger under her arm and watched them go. Then she turned to look at Caleb Dunmore. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her like she had said something he wasn't sure how to answer. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "You just made an enemy out of the most dangerous man in Wyoming territory. What exactly did you find in those books?" "Proof that he's stolen land from 43 families through forged contracts." Caleb was quiet for 2 seconds. "And you told him that?" "I did." To his face. "That's generally how telling someone something works. Mr. Dunmore. Caleb Dunmore." He studied her with an expression that was not quite admiration, and not quite alarm, but something uncomfortably between the two. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met, or you have no idea what you've just done." "I know exactly what I've done," Maggie said. "What I don't know yet is what I'm going to do next." Dorothy Vasquez found her 20 minutes later sitting alone at the back table of the Creekside Cafe, the ledger open in front of her, and 3 sheets of copied figures spread beside it. Dorothy set down a cup of coffee without asking and pulled out the chair across the table and sat down in it like she owned everything in a 10-foot radius, which in her own establishment she did. "Hatch is going to come after you tonight," Dorothy said. "Not tomorrow. Tonight." Maggie looked up. "You know him well." "I know men like him. I've known them my whole life." Dorothy's voice was matter-of-fact, the kind of matter-of-fact that came from having survived things rather than read about them. "In 1873, I applied to Hatch's bank for a loan to expand this kitchen. $500. I had the collateral. I had the business record." "You know what he told me?" Maggie shook her head. "He told me that he didn't lend money to Mexican women because they couldn't be trusted to repay it." That was his exact language. Couldn't be trusted. Dorothy picked up her own coffee cup and looked at it. "I've been watching him steal this town blind for 6 years. I watched him foreclose on the Hendersons last spring. I watched him push the McCreadys off their east pasture in October." She set the cup down. "I've been watching and doing nothing because I have a daughter and a business, and I know what men like Hatch do to people who stand up alone." She looked at Maggie directly. "But you're not alone anymore if you want to not be." Maggie looked at the woman across from her, the careful steadiness in her face, the 6 years of watching and waiting and holding still that lived behind her eyes, and felt something pull loose in her chest. She had not cried since she opened that first forged contract 2 weeks ago. She did not cry now. But the pressure behind her sternum was significant. "I need somewhere safe to keep these documents tonight," Maggie said. "I have a floorboard in the back kitchen that Hatch doesn't know about," Dorothy said. "Nobody does. And I need to know who in this town I can trust." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. "There are maybe 4 people. Maybe 5 if Caleb Dunmore is having a good week. He helped me in the street." "He did." Dorothy said it thoughtfully, like she was turning the fact over in her hands. "That's not nothing. Caleb hasn't helped anyone publicly in about 2 years. Not since—" She stopped. "That's his story to tell, not mine." Maggie folded the copied documents carefully and slid them across to Dorothy. "Then I need to talk to him." She found Caleb at the livery stable, checking his horse's left foreleg with the focused attention of a man who had decided to be very busy for the next several minutes. He heard her come in and did not look up. "I need your help," Maggie said. "I figured you might." He ran his hand down the horse's leg one more time. Then he straightened and turned to face her. "And I'm going to tell you what I told the last person who asked me to go up against Cornelius Hatch. It cost him his ranch, his cattle, and 18 months in a territorial prison on a cattle theft charge that everyone in this town knew was manufactured. So before you ask me to do anything, Miss Aldrin, I need to understand exactly what you have and whether it's enough. 43 forged contracts, Maggie said. His handwriting on the forgeries, his initials on the internal transfer orders, payments in the secondary ledger to 2 land agents who no longer work for him and who left town very suddenly in October. She paused. It's enough to convict him if it gets in front of a judge who isn't his. The closest judge who isn't his is in Cheyenne, Caleb said. That's 4 days by rail, assuming the passes aren't snowed in which they currently are. Then we make enough noise here that he can't make the evidence disappear before the passes clear. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. The lantern light in the stable was low and yellow, and his face in it was difficult to read, not closed exactly but careful. The face of a man who had learned to check what he was feeling before he showed it. You know what he'll do when he realizes you're not getting on that train tomorrow, Caleb said. I have a theory. He'll go after the people who helped you. Dorothy, whoever else you've spoken to. He'll make sure that standing near you costs more than anyone in this town can afford to pay. His voice was even and very quiet. I've seen him do it. The man he put in prison, Tom Briggs. Tom had a wife and 3 children. After Tom was arrested, Hatch called in every debt that family owed. They were out of their house in 2 weeks. The children spent last winter in a leaking room above the feed store. He stopped. I didn't stop it. I didn't do enough. And I have thought about that every day since. The words sat between them heavy and specific. Maggie recognized them for what they were, not an excuse, but a wound that hadn't finished healing. I'm not asking you to take a risk. I'm not willing to take myself, she said. I'm an accountant, Mr. Dunmore. I work with numbers and documents and paper trails. If Hatch tries to remove me, the evidence becomes more valuable, not less, because then there's a reason to remove it. She met his eyes directly. I need someone who knows this town, who knows where the pressure points are, and who isn't afraid of Cornelius Hatch. Dorothy tells me you used to do investigative work. Dorothy talks too much. Is it true? He was quiet for a moment. I worked investigations for a Chicago rail company for 6 years, before I came here. Then you know how men like Hatch operate. You know what they protect and what they expose when they're frightened. I also know what they're capable of when they're backed into a corner. He looked at her steadily. Miss Aldrin, I want to be clear about something. I don't know you. I don't know if you're telling the truth about what you found. I don't know if you're brave or just reckless. I helped you in the street today because Duval had no legal authority to touch you, and that bothered me regardless of what you did or didn't take from Hatch's office. But what you're describing, going after the most powerful man in this territory, with documents that are currently in your possession and nowhere else, that's not bravery. That's an invitation to disappear. Unless I make sure enough people know about it that my disappearing would raise more questions than my staying ever could, Maggie said. That's the strategy, not confrontation. Documentation, dissemination. Make the information too widespread for him to contain. She watched his face. It worked once before, in St. Louis, against a man twice as connected as Hatch. It took 4 months, and I spent most of it living out of a single traveling bag, but it worked. The horse shifted behind Caleb. He reached back without looking and set his hand briefly on its neck. 4 months, he said, give or take. And you think Harlan Creek will hold together for 4 months against Hatch's pressure? I think it'll hold together long enough if the right people are standing in the right places. She paused. Are you one of those people? Caleb Dunmore looked at Margaret Aldrin in the low light of a livery stable in December, in a Wyoming Territory winter, with the passes snowed shut, and a corrupt banker making plans 200 yards away, and said nothing for what felt like a very long time. Then he said, I'll need to read everything you have. I expected you would. Tonight, before Hatch moves. Dorothy's kitchen, 8 o'clock. He picked his hat up from the post where it hung and turned it once in his hands, slowly, a gesture she would come to recognize over the following weeks as the thing he did when he was deciding something he already knew he was going to do. "Miss Aldrin," he said. "Maggie." He looked up. Something shifted fractionally in his expression. "Don't mistake my helping you for certainty," he said. "I've been certain before. It cost people I cared about more than it cost me, so I'm not certain. I'm just—" He stopped. "You're just here," Maggie said quietly. He put his hat on. "For now," he said. "For now." Outside, the wind had picked up driving fine snow along the frozen street. Somewhere across town in the warm, lamp-lit interior of Harlan Creek Savings and Land Trust, Cornelius Hatch was writing a letter. His hands were steady. His ink was good. His handwriting was careful and deliberate, because Cornelius Hatch had spent 30 years understanding one thing above all others: that in the end, everything in the world came down to what was written on paper and who controlled the pen. He did not yet know that tonight, for the first time in a very long time, he was not the only one in this town who understood that. Dorothy's back kitchen smelled like wood smoke and rendered lard, and it was the warmest room Maggie had been in since leaving St. Louis. The floorboard was exactly where Dorothy said it would be, third plank from the east wall, loose at one end, hollow underneath. Dorothy pulled it up without ceremony and retrieved a flat tin box that held Maggie's copied documents, alongside a small bundle of letters tied with kitchen twine. "These came to me over the past 2 years," Dorothy said, setting the box on the work table. "Families who lost land. Some of them wrote to the Territorial Land Office and got no answer. Some of them wrote to the railroad company and got no answer. A few of them wrote to me because they didn't know who else to write to." She pushed the bundle toward Maggie. "I kept them because I didn't know what else to do with them." Maggie untied the twine and began reading. The letters were short, most of them. The kind of short that comes not from having little to say, but from not trusting paper to hold the full weight of what happened to you. One was from a woman named Ellen Briggs. Maggie recognized the name. "Tom Briggs's wife," she said. "Written 4 months after he went to prison." Dorothy sat down across the table. "She left Harlan Creek in February. I don't know where she went." Maggie read the letter twice, then set it carefully aside. She was still reading the third letter when she heard the knock at the back door, 2 quick, 1 slow, and Dorothy got up and let Caleb in. He came in out of the cold with snow on his hat brim and looked at the documents spread across the work table with the focused attention of a man who was already working. He didn't say good evening. He pulled out a chair, sat down, and began to read. For 20 minutes, nobody spoke. Dorothy refilled the coffee. The fire in the stove settled and popped. Outside, the wind drove snow against the shuttered window in long, hissing waves. "He used the same 2 witnesses on 31 of the 43 contracts," Caleb said finally. He pointed to 2 names that appeared in the margins of multiple entries. Len Probst and Arthur Sims, both listed as notarizing officers. "Both left town in October," Maggie said. 3 weeks before I arrived. Where did they go?" "I don't know yet, but their departure date matches a series of internal transfers in the secondary ledger. Hatch moved money out of his own speculative account the same week they left. I think he paid them off and sent them somewhere he could reach them if he needed them, and somewhere they couldn't easily be found if someone came looking." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Probst had a sister in Laramie," he said. "I knew him slightly. He wasn't a bad man, just not a strong one. The kind of man who does what he's told when the person telling him has enough money." He looked up from the documents. "If we could find him and get a statement." "He won't give one voluntarily," Maggie said. "Not against Hatch." "No, but there are ways to make not giving one feel more dangerous than giving one." He said it without heat, as a plain fact. "That's not a threat, Miss Aldrin. It's leverage. The same kind Hatch uses, only pointed in a different direction." "Maggie," she said. You agreed to that earlier. He looked at her briefly. Maggie, he said, and went back to reading. Dorothy was watching both of them with the expression of a woman who had learned to read rooms the way other people read books. She said nothing, but she refilled Caleb's coffee without being asked. It was past 10 o'clock when Caleb finally sat back in his chair and looked at the full spread of documents. Here's what I know, he said. This is enough to convict Hatch in front of a fair judge. It is not enough to stop him before he moves against you, because a fair judge is 4 days away in conditions that currently make the road to Cheyenne impassable. Which means we have somewhere between 12 and 48 hours before he decides that making you disappear is cleaner than waiting you out. He won't, Dorothy started. He put Tom Briggs in prison for 18 months on a manufactured charge, Caleb said. Briggs was a man with connections and a family, and people in this town who liked him. Maggie is an out-of-town woman with no family here and no history here and a reputation Hatch can shape however he wants before anyone outside Wyoming hears a different version. He wasn't saying it to frighten her. He was saying it because it was true, and he had decided she needed true things more than comfortable ones. So, what we need is speed and noise. We need enough people to know enough of this story that removing her becomes a problem instead of a solution. Who in this town will stand up publicly? Maggie asked Dorothy. Dorothy considered it with the seriousness it deserved. Reverend Ames won't lie for Hatch, but he won't move fast. Peter Calloway at the telegraph office. Hatch tried to buy his building out from under him last year, and Peter has been quietly furious about it ever since. The Henderson family, if someone goes to them directly. They know what was done to them. They've just been too afraid to say it out loud. She paused. Margaret Wells runs the town council. She's been trying to operate independent of Hatch for 2 years, and hasn't been able to because he controls too many votes. But if the votes shifted, they'll shift if the evidence is in front of people before Hatch can characterize it, Maggie said. She looked at Caleb. You know this territory. What's the fastest way to get word to the land office in Cheyenne? Telegraph, he said. If Calloway sends it. Peter will send it, Dorothy said. Tonight, if we go to him now. Hatch monitors the telegraph office, Caleb said. Not openly, but his clerk checks the log. Then we send the message in 2 parts from 2 different offices, Maggie said. Neither of which on its own looks like anything. Peter sends the first half. Is there another telegraph station within riding distance? Ridgeville, 8 miles east. Caleb looked at her. I can write it in an hour and a half in these conditions. Then you write it. Tonight, before Hatch has time to think through his options. She was already refolding the documents, sorting them into 2 groups. I'll take the originals to Peter Calloway. You take copies to Ridgeville. The message goes to the Territorial Land Office and to the Federal Marshal's Office in Cheyenne. Short, specific, factual enough that they know what to look for when the pass is clear. Caleb watched her work for a moment. You planned this before you came tonight, he said. It wasn't an accusation. I planned contingencies, Maggie said. I didn't know which one I'd need. You planned it before you walked into Hatch's office this morning. She looked up. I knew what was in those books 2 weeks ago. I spent 2 weeks making copies and deciding whether I was going to act on them or sign the quarterly statements and take my wage and go back to St. Louis. She held his gaze. I chose to act. That means I had to be ready for what comes next. Something changed in Caleb's expression. Not softening exactly, but a kind of recalibration. The way a man looks when he realizes he has been measuring something against the wrong scale. He picked up his hat. I'll need the copies now, he said. I want to be back before 2 in the morning. Maggie handed him the folded documents. Their fingers didn't quite touch in the exchange, but the moment had a particular quality to it, the kind of particular quality that both of them noticed and neither of them acknowledged. Be careful, Dorothy said to him. Always am. He looked at Maggie once more. Lock the front door of the cafe after you leave Peter Calloway's. Don't go back to Mrs. Crane's tonight. Where should I go? Stay here. Dorothy's back room. It's not comfortable, but it's not visible from the street. He pulled his coat collar up. Hatch has 2 men who do his rough work. Names are Denny Cole and a man who goes by Trace. They're not subtle and they're not patient. You'll know them if you see them. Cole has a broken nose that didn't set right. Trace is tall and never takes his hat off indoors. He pushed open the back door. If either of them comes through any door you're behind, you make noise, loud and immediately. This town sleeps light. He was gone before she could reply, the cold rushing in for a moment and then retreating when the door closed. Dorothy latched it. He's been waiting to do something like this for 2 years, Dorothy said quietly, turning back to the fire. He just needed a reason that felt solid enough. Maggie looked at the door where Caleb had been standing. Why did he leave investigative work? Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Like I said, that's his story." Peter Calloway was a thin, precise man with ink-stained fingers and the kind of alert stillness that telegraph operators developed after years of listening to silence for signals. He answered his door in his vest and shirt sleeves, looked at Maggie, looked at the documents she carried, and said, "I heard you had a difficult afternoon." "I had a productive one," Maggie said. "I need to use your telegraph." He opened the door wider. "Come in." His office was exactly what she expected. Neat, organized, every surface serving a purpose. He read the message she had drafted twice, made one small suggestion about the phrasing of the second paragraph that made it cleaner, and sent it at 11:14 in the evening without hesitation. "Hatch's clerk will see this in the log," he said when it was done. "I know," Maggie said. "That's partly the point. I want Hatch to know it's already gone. It changes his calculation." She paused. "Mr. Calloway, I need to ask you something directly. If this goes to a formal investigation, if federal marshals come to Harlan Creek and start asking questions, will you tell them what you know about how Hatch operates in this town?" Peter Calloway looked at the telegraph key on his desk for a moment. His expression was the careful expression of a man adding up costs against something that wasn't money. "My father built this station," he said. "Strung the wire himself from Ridgeville. Took him 4 months." He picked up a small pair of pliers from the desk and set them down again. "Hatch tried to buy it in March for about 1/3 of what it's worth. When I said no, he told me my renewal license for territorial operations might encounter delays. I've been waiting 9 months for a renewal that should have taken 30 days. He looked up. "Yes, Miss Aldrin. I'll tell them what I know." She walked back to Dorothy's cafe in the dark through cold that had teeth in it, with the wind finding every gap in her coat. The main street was empty. Lamplight showed in a few windows the saloon, the sheriff's office, one upstairs room above the dry goods store. She thought about Cornelius Hatch in his house on the hill above the creek, adding up his own calculations. And she thought about 43 families who had written letters that nobody answered. She thought about her father sitting at his kitchen table the morning after the bankmen came, turning a piece of paper over and over in his hands. She had been 16 years old, and she had not understood, not then, what that piece of paper was. She understood it now. It was a foreclosure notice on land that had been in her family for 22 years, and her father had spent 3 months trying to find the error in it, because he could not accept that there was no error, that it had been done on purpose by men who could, to a man who couldn't stop them. He had died believing it was a mistake. She had spent 15 years learning that it wasn't. Dorothy was waiting when she came in. The fire banked low. 2 cups of something that turned out to be not coffee, but something warmer and less definite. Maggie sat down and wrapped both hands around the cup. "Peter sent it," she said. "Good." Dorothy sat across from her. "Now we wait for Caleb." "Tell me about the Henderson family," Maggie said. "I want to know who they are before I ask them to trust me." Dorothy told her. The Hendersons had come to Wyoming from Nebraska in 1871. Frank Henderson, his wife Ruth, and 3 children, who were now 4 children, because the youngest had been born the first winter in the territory. Frank had run cattle on 300 acres east of town, good grassland, with a creek running through it, the kind of land that was worth 3 times what it had been valued at when he bought it, because it sat directly in the path of the projected rail expansion. Hatch had begun acquiring the neighboring parcels in 1877. When Frank had refused to sell, a mortgage document had been filed in the Territorial Land Office showing that Frank Henderson had borrowed $1,100 from Harlan Creek Savings in 1875 and had not paid it back. Frank Henderson had never borrowed $1,100 from anyone. He had said so in the land office in writing to 3 different officials. Nothing had happened. "He came to me last spring," Dorothy said, "just to talk. He didn't know what else to do. His wife was trying to hold the family together while Frank wasn't doing well. Men like Frank, they build things. They work themselves into the ground building something real, something that belongs to them, something they can hand to their children. When you take that from them—" She stopped. "Ruth is the one who kept them together. She's the one who should be thanked." "Will they talk to me?" "If you come to them honestly. Frank is suspicious of anyone from outside, especially anyone connected to money or documents. But Ruth will listen." Dorothy looked at her steadily. "Don't tell them you have a plan. Tell them the truth, that you found evidence of what was done to them and you need their help to stop it from being done to anyone else. They'll respond to the truth better than to a plan." Caleb came back at 1:47 in the morning. He came in cold and efficient, handed Maggie the confirmation from the Ridgeville telegraph operator, and accepted the cup Dorothy handed him without comment. He sat down at the work table and looked at Maggie with that measuring expression she was beginning to recognize. "Message sent," he said. "Ridgeville operator's name is Sam Hooper. He's reliable." He paused. "I saw Denny Cole on the road coming back. He was riding toward town from the direction of Hatch's house." The room got very still. "He see you?" Dorothy asked. "Not well. I was off the road." He looked at Maggie. "Hatch is moving faster than I expected. He's not waiting until morning." "Then neither do we," Maggie said. She reached for the documents. "We go to the Hendersons at first light, before Hatch can reach them first." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should tell you something about why I left investigative work." He said it without preamble, the way he said most things, directly and slightly uncomfortably, like a man paying a debt he'd been carrying too long. "The company I worked for in Chicago. They were involved in land acquisition along a rail corridor in Kansas. I found evidence of fraud, forged contracts, intimidated sellers, a pattern very similar to what Hatch is running here. I compiled the documentation. I brought it to my supervisor." He stopped. He buried it. Not because he didn't believe me, because the men running the scheme were investors in the company. Exposing them would have cost the company more than the fraud was worth. He looked at the table. "I resigned. I came here. I told myself I was done with it, with all of it, because doing the right thing and watching it get buried is worse than not doing it at all." A pause. "I was wrong about that. It's not worse. It's just hard." Maggie looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved against the walls of Dorothy's cafe with a sound like something that wanted in. "It's going to be hard here too," she said. "I want you to know that going in, Hatch has money, and he has time, and he has men. What we have is documentation, and 3 people sitting in a kitchen at 2 in the morning." She met his eyes. "But the documentation is real, and that matters. That's the thing. My father never had one person who could read the numbers and tell him they were lying. I had to become that person myself. I'm not going to waste it." Caleb looked at her with that expression she couldn't quite name, the one that wasn't admiration and wasn't alarm, but lived in the space between them. "First light," he said. "Henderson Place." "First light," Maggie agreed. Dorothy blew out the lamp. The fire in the stove went on burning low, and even in the dark, and the 3 of them sat with the documents between them and the cold outside the walls, each one carrying their own version of the same thought, that tomorrow would be harder than today, and that they were going to do it anyway. The Henderson farm sat 2 miles east of Harlan Creek on a stretch of flat land that the December frost had turned the color of old iron. Caleb drove the wagon. Maggie sat beside him with the documents under her coat, and her breath making small clouds in the pre-dawn dark. Neither of them spoke for the first mile, which was not uncomfortable silence, but the functional silence of two people who had been awake all night and were conserving what they had left for what was coming. It was Caleb who spoke first. "Ruth Henderson is going to ask you how you found the forgeries," he said, not taking his eyes off the road. "She's going to want to know if you're certain. She's been told by 3 different officials that her husband was wrong about the mortgage. She needs to hear it from someone who can explain the numbers in plain language, not legal language." "I can do that." "I know you can. I'm telling you because Frank is going to be in the room, and Frank is going to be angry, and when Frank gets angry, he talks over Ruth. Don't let him. Ruth is the one who decides things in that family, even if Frank doesn't know it." Maggie looked at him. "You know them well." "I've known Frank 6 years. I lent him a bull 2 winters ago when his died. We're not close, but we're neighbors, which in Wyoming means something different than it does in a city." He paused. "I should have done more when Hatch took his land. I knew what was happening. I told myself it wasn't my fight." His jaw tightened briefly. "I've been telling myself that about a lot of things." The wagon rolled on. The sky ahead was beginning to separate itself from the land in a thin gray line along the eastern ridge. Ruth Henderson answered the door before they knocked, which meant she had heard the wagon coming and had been watching from the window. She was a compact woman in her late 30s, with the specific kind of calm that comes not from an easy life, but from having survived a hard one without becoming brittle. She looked at Caleb, then at Maggie, then at the documents visible at the edge of Maggie's coat. "Come in," she said. "I'll get Frank." Frank Henderson came out of the back room with the expression of a man who has been startled awake by the wrong kind of news too many times and has stopped being surprised by it. He was broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, with hands that had been doing hard work for so long they had permanently changed shape. He looked at Caleb with the wary recognition of a man who respected but did not yet trust the visit. "Done more," he said. "Early for a social call." "It's not social," Caleb said. "Miss Aldrin works accounts. She was hired by Hatch to sign off on his quarterly statements. She found something instead." Frank looked at Maggie with the specific suspicion he reserved for anyone connected to money and paper. "What kind of something?" "Sit down," Maggie said. "Both of you. I want to show you something and I want you to look at it before you say anything." She set the documents on the table. She opened the copied ledger pages to the entry she had marked specifically for this conversation, the entry that recorded the creation of the Henderson mortgage. She set it beside a copied land transfer document that showed the subsequent foreclosure. Then she set beside both of those a page she had written herself the previous evening, translating the coded accounting entries into plain numbered English. "This is the internal record of how your mortgage was created," she said to Frank. "Not filed, not processed, created. The entry date is March 14th, 1877. The mortgage document itself is dated January 12th, 1875, 2 years earlier, which means the document was backdated." She put her finger on a specific figure. "The handwriting on the notarization belongs to Len Probst. Probst used the same pen pressure and the same abbreviated signature style on 30 other contracts I've identified as forgeries. The signature that is supposed to be yours, Mr. Henderson, was written by someone who had seen your name in print but had never actually watched you sign it. The capital F lifts at the wrong angle." She looked up. "You didn't borrow $1,100 from Cornelius Hatch. He invented the debt, backdated the paperwork, and filed it with a territorial land office, whose reviewing officer received a payment of $200 from Hatch's account 11 days before the foreclosure was approved." The room was quiet. Ruth Henderson had both hands flat on the table. Her face had not changed expression, but her knuckles had gone white. Frank said, "I told them." His voice was very quiet and very controlled, which was worse than if he had shouted. "I told the land office. I told the territorial attorney. I wrote to the governor's office in Cheyenne." He looked at the documents and then at Maggie. They all said the same thing. They said the paperwork was in order. They said I was mistaken. "The paperwork was in order because Hatch had 2 years to make it look that way," Maggie said. "But the internal ledger entries weren't meant to be seen by anyone outside the bank. They weren't cleaned up. They still show the actual sequence of events." She paused. "You were not mistaken, Mr. Henderson. You were right. And I can prove it." Frank Henderson put one hand over his mouth. He looked at the table. He looked at the window. Ruth reached across without looking and put her hand over his. "What do you need from us?" Ruth said. "A sworn statement describing what happened, the timeline, the officials you contacted, the responses you received. Signed and witnessed. I need it today." "Today," Frank said. "Hatch knows I have this documentation. He moved against me last night. We have a narrow window before he finds a way to discredit the evidence or discredit me, and I need as many corroborating voices as possible before that window closes." She looked at them both steadily. "I know what I'm asking you to do. I know what it cost you the last time you tried to fight this. I am not going to tell you it's without risk, because it is. But the federal marshal's office in Cheyenne received a telegraph message last night. There is already a record that this information exists. Hatch can silence people, but he cannot unring that bell." Ruth looked at Caleb. "Do you believe her?" "I read everything she has," Caleb said. "Yes, I believe her." Ruth looked at her husband. Something passed between them that was not words, the specific communication of two people who have spent years in close enough quarters to have developed a private language of expression and posture and the precise weight of a shared glance. Frank gave a short, tight nod. "Tell us what to write," Ruth said. They were back on the road to Harlan Creek by 8 in the morning, the Henderson statement folded with the rest of the documents inside Maggie's coat. The sky had gone the flat white of incoming snow. Caleb drove faster than he had on the way out. "2 more families," Maggie said. "The Bautistas and the McCreadys. Dorothy said the McCreadys finished a barn last spring on land Hatch has already begun the foreclosure process on. If we can get statements from both—" "We don't have time for both," Caleb said. "Hatch's men were moving last night. By now he knows the telegraph went to Cheyenne. He'll be calculating how much damage control he can do before the marshals respond, and the first thing he'll do is go after the weakest point. Which is you. Your credibility." He glanced at her sideways. "He's going to tell this town that you came here under false pretenses, that you were sent by a competing business interest, a rival bank, a different railroad consortium to manufacture evidence against him. He'll frame it as a corporate attack dressed up as justice. Some people will believe it because it's easier to believe you're a pawn than to believe he's a criminal." Maggie had already thought of this. What stops that narrative? The Hendersons going public before he can shape the story. Peter Calloway at the telegraph office. And he stopped. And what? Margaret Wells, the council chair. He said it like a man picking up something heavy that he had set down deliberately and was not happy to be lifting again. She's been wanting to move against Hatch for 2 years. She has standing in this community that I don't and that you don't. If she endorses what you've found publicly, it changes the entire weight of the thing. Dorothy mentioned her. She said Wells has been trying to operate independently of Hatch and hasn't been able to. She hasn't been able to because she hasn't had evidence. She's had suspicion, and she's had principle, and in Harlan Creek, those don't spend like cash. He looked at the road ahead. She'll want to see everything you have. She'll ask hard questions. And she won't commit until she's certain, because Margaret Wells has been careful for a long time, and careful people don't stop being careful overnight. A pause. But if she commits fully. That's the kind of person she is. Then we go to her first, Maggie said. Before Hatch reaches her. Margaret Wells ran the town council from an office above the hardware store that she had occupied since her husband died 4 years earlier, and left her both the hardware business and the council seat he had held for 12 years. She had won her own re-election twice since then, by margins that suggested Harlan Creek trusted her judgment, which they did in the careful and slightly surprised way that communities trust competent women, fully but quietly, as though acknowledging it too loudly might invite someone to take it away. She answered. Caleb's knock herself, looked at both of them with the brisk assessment of a woman who made decisions for a living, and said, "I've been expecting someone to come through that door since I heard about what happened at the bank yesterday. Come in and sit down." Her office was ordered and practical. She listened to Maggie without interrupting, which was the kind of listening that carried its own weight. Active, precise, the kind that was already sorting and filing as the words came in. When Maggie finished, Wells held out her hand for the documents. She read every page. She asked 4 questions, all of them specific and technical, and Maggie answered each one directly. Then Wells set the papers down and folded her hands and looked at the middle distance for a moment that felt longer than it probably was. "I've known for 3 years that those mortgage filings were fraudulent," she said. "I didn't have proof. I had the testimony of Frank Henderson and 2 other ranchers, and a pattern that looked wrong to me, but that every official I contacted told me was legitimate." Her voice was level and controlled, and underneath it was something that had been sitting in a confined space for a long time. "Do you understand what it is to know that something is wrong and have no instrument to prove it? To watch families lose their land and be told by every authority you approach that the paperwork is in order?" "Yes," Maggie said. "I do understand that." Wells looked at her. Something in Maggie's tone must have carried the specific weight of someone who was not speaking abstractly, because Wells nodded once slowly. "What do you need from me?" "A public statement of support for a formal investigation. Your endorsement given before Hatch has the opportunity to frame this as a corporate attack or a personal vendetta. And your presence at a public meeting this afternoon, if we can organize one." "This afternoon." Wells looked at Caleb. "How long do we have before he moves against her directly?" "He moved last night," Caleb said. "He's already in damage control. The question is whether we get in front of the town's perception before he does." Wells stood up. She moved to the small table where her correspondents sat and picked up a pen. "I'll write the statement now, and I'll send word to the council members who aren't in Hatch's pocket. There are 4 of them, possibly 5, if Raymond Pierce has finally had enough. I'll get them to the meeting." She looked at Maggie. "Where do you want to hold it?" "Dorothy's Cafe," Maggie said. "It's the most neutral ground we have." "It's also Dorothy's ground," Wells said with a slight look that was not disapproval, but was a clear-eyed acknowledgement of what that meant. "Which tells people something about whose side the meeting is on before it starts. Can you live with that?" "I can," Maggie said. "Dorothy's been living with Hatch's decisions for 6 years. I think she's earned the right to be visibly on the right side of this one." Wells almost smiled. 2 o'clock, she said. "I'll have people there." They were on the street again by 9:30, and it was Caleb who saw Denny Cole first standing at the far end of the main street, not doing anything in particular, which was itself a statement. Cole was a thick-set man, with a nose that had been broken and hadn't been reset, and the specific quality of stillness that men cultivate when their job is to make other people feel watched. "Don't look directly at him," Caleb said quietly. "I'm not." Maggie kept walking at the same pace. "He's been there since we came out of Wells's office. He's telling Hatch we've been to see her." Caleb's hand moved to his side, and then dropped again, a gesture he controlled quickly. "Hatch will call an emergency council session. He'll try to get in front of the public meeting." "Can he?" "He controls 3 council votes, possibly 4. He can call a session and pass a motion to delay any public forum pending an official inquiry." He paused. "Which he'll then use to run out the clock until he can discredit the documents." "Then we don't give him the council session." Maggie stopped walking and turned to face Caleb directly, which had the secondary effect of making it look from Cole's vantage point like an ordinary street conversation. We make the public meeting happen before the council session. 2 o'clock gives Hatch enough time to call a session for 3. He'll be furious. Good. Furious men make mistakes. She said it with a certainty that came from having watched her father's creditors operate, from having spent 15 years studying the specific way that powerful men behaved when they felt their control slipping. The overcorrection, the overreach, the decision made in anger that unraveled the careful architecture of everything they had built. "I need one more thing," she said. "I need someone to go to the Bautista family this morning. Not me. Hatch is watching me now, and I don't want to lead his men to their door. Someone they trust." "Dorothy," Caleb said immediately. "Dorothy. She can be there and back by noon." He was already thinking past it. "Maggie, there's something you need to know before this afternoon." He said her name the way he had in Dorothy's kitchen, like it had become natural without him deciding to let it. When Hatch comes to that meeting, and he will come, he's not going to come with arguments. He's going to come with a counter-narrative, and he's going to aim it directly at the thing that makes you easiest to dismiss. That I'm a woman from out of town with a motive to manufacture evidence against him. Yes, he's going to make this about you, not about the documents. He's going to make the room decide whether to trust you before they look at what you've found. He looked at her steadily. "I've seen him do it. He's good at it. He'll find something in your history, anything, and he'll use it." Maggie was quiet for a moment. Across the street, Denny Cole had shifted his weight but hadn't moved. The snow that had been threatening all morning was beginning to fall light and deliberate, the kind of snow that committed to nothing but accumulated anyway. "There's nothing in my history that changes what's in those documents," she said. "I know that. You know that. But a room full of frightened people can be convinced to look at the person instead of the paper." His voice was careful and direct, and had that quality she had noticed from the beginning. The quality of someone who had made the mistake of underestimating how a crowd behaved, and had not forgotten the cost of it. "I'm not telling you to be afraid. I'm telling you to be ready." Maggie looked at him, at the steadiness in his face, at the way he carried the weight of 2 years of standing still and watching wrong things happen, not comfortably, but honestly, without the self-deception that would have made it easier. He had told her last night why he left investigative work. He hadn't told it to her as an excuse. He had told it as a fact about himself that she deserved to have before she decided how much to rely on him. She realized, standing in the cold morning street with snow beginning to catch in her hair and Hatch's man watching from 50 yards away, that she was relying on him already, not as a protector, not as someone to stand in front of her, but as someone who stood beside her and looked at the same things she was looking at, with eyes that had been trained to see clearly. "I'll be ready," she said. "Will you?" He looked at her for a moment with that expression she still couldn't entirely name. Then he said, "I stopped being ready 2 years ago. I'm starting again." A pause, very brief. "I think that's enough." They walked back toward Dorothy's cafe with the snow coming down around them and the documents safe inside Maggie's coat, and 2 o'clock 4 hours away, and if Denny Cole followed them from a distance, they did not look back to check, because looking back was not what either of them was doing anymore. Part 3. Lưu ý viết 2.500 đến 2.800 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại, tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề. Tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc chân thực và gần gũi, không mô tả cảnh, tập trung vào hành động, cảm xúc và tâm lý nhân vật. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ độ kịch tính, không viết lân mạn kết thúc phần, không giới thiệu phần sau. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang mức document 1544. Xác định yêu cầu phần tiếp theo và lập kế hoạch tiếp tục câu chuyện. Xác định yêu cầu phần tiếp theo và lập kế hoạch tiếp tục câu chuyện. Dorothy had the cafe cleared of its usual lunch crowd by 1:30, which required no explanation beyond the look on her face when she asked people to leave. She had been in Harlan Creek long enough that certain expressions of hers carried the weight of full sentences, and the expression she wore while stacking chairs against the back wall said plainly that whatever was happening this afternoon was not optional and not small, and that anyone who had somewhere else to be ought to go there now. She had come back from the Bautista farm at noon, with Rosa Bautista's written statement folded inside her apron, and the particular set to her jaw that meant the visit had cost something. Maggie read the statement at the kitchen table, while Dorothy poured coffee she didn't drink. She was afraid, Dorothy said. Her husband wasn't home. I had to wait 40 minutes for him to come in from the field, and another 20 minutes convincing him I wasn't working for Hatch. She sat down heavily. Luis Bautista is a proud man. It took everything he had to write that statement because writing it meant admitting out loud that he couldn't protect his own family. That's not a small thing to ask a man. I know, Maggie said. I'm grateful. Don't be grateful yet. Be successful. Dorothy wrapped both hands around her own cup. Because if this meeting this afternoon doesn't move this town, Luis Bautista just put a target on his family for nothing. The weight of that sat between them without either of them trying to move it. Maggie looked at the Henderson statement, the Bautista statement, the copied ledger pages, the telegraph confirmation from Peter Calloway, the page of translated accounting entries she had written in plain language the night before. Laid out on Dorothy's work table, it was a complete picture, the kind of picture that was undeniable to anyone who looked at it honestly. The problem, as Caleb had said that morning, was getting people to look at the picture instead of at the person holding it. Caleb came in at 1:45 with Raymond Pierce, who turned out to be a weathered man of about 60, who ran the feed store and had the careful movements of someone who had been watching for trouble from a specific direction for long enough that it had become automatic. He shook Maggie's hand, looked at the documents, and said, "I've been waiting 3 years for someone to walk in with exactly this." Margaret Wells said you might be persuaded, Maggie said. Margaret Wells is more diplomatic than I am. He picked up the Henderson statement and read it with the focused attention of a man to whom paper had always meant something real and consequential. Frank Henderson is the most honest rancher in this county. If he says this mortgage was invented, it was invented. He set the statement down. What do you need me to do? Sit in the front row this afternoon. And don't look uncertain, Caleb said from the doorway. Pierce looked at him with something between exasperation and respect. You got more useful since you stopped hiding on that ranch Dunmore. I wasn't hiding. You were hiding. Caleb didn't argue. People began arriving at 2 o'clock with the snow still falling and the specific self-consciousness of a town that knew it was doing something that would be talked about afterward. They came in ones and twos, pulling off hats and stamping boots, choosing their seats with the particular care of people who understood that where you sat in a room like this one said something about where you stood. Margaret Wells arrived exactly on time with 2 council members behind her, and the third a man named Arthur Fry, who ran the grain elevator hovering at the door with the expression of someone who had not yet decided which version of this day he wanted to be part of. Frank and Ruth Henderson came in together, Frank walking with the rigid posture of a man who had walked into official rooms before and been dismissed and was doing it anyway. Ruth's hand was on his arm, light but deliberate, the way you steady something valuable when the ground is uncertain. The room held perhaps 30 people by 2:15. Not the whole town, not even close, but enough. Maggie thought watching them arrange themselves enough if they were the right 30. She was standing at the front of the room with her documents on the table beside her, and she was aware of every eye that came through the door and assessed her and made its preliminary judgment before she had said a word. She was a woman from out of town. She was young-ish, plain-dressed, without the local history that gave a person weight in a place like this. She knew what Caleb had said was right, that Hatch would aim his counter-narrative directly at the easiest thing to target, which was her credibility as a person, rather than the credibility of what she had found. She had spent the hour before the meeting deciding how to handle that, and she had come to a conclusion that she had not told Caleb about yet because she had not wanted to have the argument. Cornelius Hatch arrived at 2:17 with Sheriff Duvall and a man Maggie had not seen before, a lawyer she judged from the quality of his coat and the way he carried a leather case with the possessive attention of someone whose weapons were made of paper. Hatch looked around the room with the practiced composure of a man who had walked into difficult rooms for 30 years and had learned to treat them as theaters rather than threats. He found a seat near the back and sat down without speaking, which was itself a kind of speech. Duvall remained standing near the door. His hand rested near his gun in the reflexive way of men who had carried one long enough that it became a resting place rather than a statement. Maggie noted it and looked away. Margaret Wells opened the meeting with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had run difficult council sessions and was not intimidated by the weight of the room. She stated the purpose, a public presentation of evidence concerning land acquisition practices within Harlan Creek's county boundaries, and introduced Maggie by her professional credentials, certified accountant, trained in St. Louis, contracted by Harlan Creek Savings and Land Trust to review quarterly accounts. Then she sat down and looked at Maggie and nodded once, and Maggie stood up. She did not begin with the documents. That was the decision she had made in the hour before the meeting, the one she hadn't told Caleb about. She began with her father. "My father's name was George Aldrin," she said. "He ran a small textile business in St. Louis for 22 years. In the winter of 1864, a bank filed a foreclosure notice on his property based on a mortgage document he had never signed. He spent 3 months trying to prove it was fraudulent. Every official he approached told him the paperwork was in order. He died the following year, believing he had somehow failed to understand his own finances." She paused. He hadn't failed. He had been stolen from. "I spent 15 years becoming an accountant because I needed to understand what he couldn't, how men like Cornelius Hatch manufacture paper and how you prove it." The room was very quiet. Hatch's expression had not changed, but something behind his eyes had shifted, a rapid recalculation. She thought of which angle to attack from. She let the silence hold for exactly 1 more second. Then she opened the ledger. She went through the evidence methodically and in plain language, the way she had explained it to the Hendersons that morning, not performing expertise, but translating it, making each fraudulent entry as legible as a basic arithmetic problem, because that was what it was. Forgery and fraud at their core were arithmetic problems, numbers that didn't add up, dates that appeared in the wrong sequence, signatures that looked right until you put them beside the real ones. Halfway through, she called Ruth Henderson forward and asked her to describe in her own words what had happened to her family. Ruth stood up without hesitation and spoke clearly and without embellishment. The visit from Hatch's representative. The mortgage document she had never seen before, the land office officials who told Frank he was mistaken. The winter her youngest had been sick, and she had spent it not knowing whether they would have a home in the spring. She sat down to a silence that had a different quality from the silence at the beginning of the meeting. Then Maggie called Frank. Frank Henderson stood up and said 4 sentences, all of them short and specific, and said in the voice of a man who had been carrying the words for 18 months. He sat back down, and Ruth put her hand over his again. "That is a moving personal story," Hatch said from the back of the room. His voice was measured, carrying the tone of a man making reluctant corrections to something he wished he didn't have to address. "I do not doubt that the Hendersons believe everything they've said, but belief is not evidence." He stood up slowly. "Miss Aldrin arrived in Harlan Creek 3 weeks ago. She had no prior connection to this community. She was hired through a placement agency in St. Louis, an agency that I have since learned has previously placed agents for a banking consortium in Kansas City that has been attempting to acquire land in this territory for 2 years." He let that sit for a moment. "I am not suggesting Miss Aldrin is a dishonest woman. I am suggesting that she may have been used by people with interests in this territory to manufacture a case against a community institution that has been the financial backbone of Harlan Creek for 15 years. The room stirred. Maggie had been waiting for it and had promised herself she would not react to it, and she kept that promise. She watched the faces in the room instead. The people who were nodding slightly. The people who were looking from Hatch to her and back again, with the particular anxiety of those who did not want to choose wrong. Arthur Fry, still near the door, had shifted his weight. "That is a very specific claim, Mr. Hatch," Margaret Wells said from the front row. "The name of this banking consortium." "I have documentation." "The name," Wells said with a patience that was more dangerous than sharpness. A brief pause. "First Territorial Partners based in Kansas City." "I have never worked for or been contracted by First Territorial Partners or any affiliated company," Maggie said. She said it without heat directly to the room. "Mr. Hatch knows this because I gave him a full employment history when I was hired, which his own office would have verified. My prior contracts are with 3 mercantile companies in St. Louis, 1 grain trading firm in Kansas, and an estate accounting practice in Cincinnati. All of these are a matter of verifiable record." She looked at the room. "Mr. Hatch is doing what he always does when evidence appears that threatens him. He is making this about me. He is asking you to look at the person rather than at the paper. I am asking you to look at the paper." "The paper was obtained illegally," Hatch said. His voice had sharpened slightly the first crack in the measured composure. "She took documents from my private office without authorization. Under territorial law, improperly obtained documents cannot." "She was your accountant," Caleb said. He had been standing against the side wall, and now he spoke without raising his voice, which was somehow more effective than if he had. "She was authorized to access your accounts as part of her contracted duties. Unless you're prepared to argue that an accountant reviewing accounts is a criminal act, Mr. Hatch, the question of how she obtained those documents answers itself." Duval's hand moved near his gun. "Easy, Carl," said Raymond Pierce from the front row without turning around. "That gun stays in its holster in this room, or we'll have a much more serious conversation about what kind of sheriff this town has been paying for." The room held its breath. Duval's hand stilled. Hatch looked at his lawyer. The lawyer leaned in and said something brief and quiet that Maggie could not hear. Hatch straightened and looked at the room again with the expression of a man recalculating in real time, not panicked, not yet, but genuinely uncertain for the first time since she had known him, which was only a few weeks, but felt longer. "These are serious allegations," Hatch said. "They deserve a serious proper investigation by appropriate authorities, not a performance in a cafe." He looked at Wells. "I'm calling for a formal council session to establish an independent review process. Until that process is complete, I would urge everyone in this room to withhold judgment." "A council session you'll use to appoint the reviewers," Wells said flatly. "A council session that follows established procedure." "Your established procedure," Frank Henderson said. It was the first thing he had said since his 4 sentences, and it came out with the specific weight of a man who had been polite for a very long time and had finished being polite. "Your procedure put me off my land. Your procedure took 300 acres from the Bautistas. Your procedure has been running this town for 15 years, and every time someone challenged it, you called it proper and legal and legitimate. And meanwhile, the paper you put in the land office had my name on it, and I never wrote it." The room shifted again differently this time. Not the uncertain shifting of people trying to choose between competing versions of events, but the heavier movement of people who had been waiting for someone to say the plain thing and had finally heard it said. Arthur Fry, near the door, sat down in the nearest available chair. It was a small action and a significant one. Sitting down meant he was staying. Staying meant he had decided. "I have a question for you, Mr. Hatch," Maggie said. She waited until he looked at her. "Len Probst and Arthur Sims, your notarizing officers. They left town in October 3 weeks before I arrived. Can you tell this room where they are now?" A pause that lasted exactly 1 second too long. "I don't monitor the personal movements of former employees," Hatch said. "They left 3 days after you made a payment of $400 from your personal account to an address in Laramie," Maggie said. The entry in your secondary ledger reads, Relocation Assistance. Is that standard practice for employees who leave your bank? Mr. Hatch relocation assistance to an address you won't share with a town that might want to speak with them. Hatch looked at his lawyer again. The lawyer's expression had acquired a new quality, the careful blankness of a professional man, realizing that his client had not told him everything. I'd like to see that ledger entry, Wells said. Maggie set the relevant page on the table. Wells picked it up, read it, and passed it to Raymond Pierce. Pierce read it and passed it to the council member beside him. The page moved through the front row with the quiet efficiency of evidence doing its work. Hatch said, I think this meeting has run its course. It hasn't, Wells said, and her voice had the quality of a door closing. Sit down, Mr. Hatch. Something happened in the room then that Maggie had seen happen once before in a St. Louis courtroom when she was 23 years old and watching a commodities case that had taken 4 months to build. It was not a dramatic moment. It was almost quiet. It was the moment when the weight of evidence crossed a threshold in enough minds simultaneously that the room's center of gravity shifted and the person who had been the most powerful presence in it became suddenly the most precarious one. Hatch sat down. It was not surrender. Maggie was too experienced to mistake it for that. He sat down because standing was costing him more than sitting, and he was still calculating, still looking for the angle that put him back in control, and she knew that calculation would not stop until he was in front of a judge or completely out of options. But for right now, in this room, in this moment, he sat down. Caleb moved from the wall to the front of the room and stood beside Maggie, not in front of her, beside her, which was the specific positioning of someone who understood the difference. He looked at the room with the steady look of a man who had stopped hiding on his ranch and was finding with some surprise that the open ground wasn't as impossible as he had expected. Federal marshals are coming from Cheyenne when the pass is clear, he said. The telegraph went last night. The evidence is already on record at the Territorial Land Office. What happens in this room today doesn't determine the legal outcome. The documents do that. What it determines is what kind of town Harlan Creek is going to be while we're waiting. He looked at the faces in front of him, ranchers and merchants and a cafe owner and a man from a feed store who had finally sat down. Are you going to let one man decide that for you, or are you going to decide it yourselves? The snow outside was coming down harder now. It pressed against the windows of Dorothy's cafe with a low, even sound, patient and indifferent to the proceedings inside. Maggie stood at the front of the room with everything she had built over 3 weeks arranged before her in plain language on plain paper. And she looked at the town of Harlan Creek, looking back at her, and she understood with the particular clarity that came from having been through this once before and survived it, that the next decision was not hers to make. It was theirs. And the room slowly began to speak. The room spoke for 45 minutes, and it was not clean or orderly, or anything like what Maggie had imagined when she had planned this meeting in Dorothy's kitchen the night before. People talked over each other. A man named Gus Whitfield, who ran the sawmill and owed Hatch money on a business loan, stood up and said he didn't see how any of this was proven, and sat back down red-faced when Raymond Pierce reminded him quietly that his loan agreement had an interest rate that was not legal under territorial statute. And perhaps he'd like to talk about that too. A woman whose name Maggie didn't know started crying in the middle row, and her husband put his arm around her, and they stayed through everything that followed. Arthur Fry asked 3 careful questions about the legal standing of the documents and seemed satisfied with the answers. Then asked a 4th question about what happened to people who publicly supported a challenge to Hatch and did not seem satisfied with that answer, but stayed anyway. Hatch said very little after he sat down. He let his lawyer do what lawyers do, ask procedural questions, raise evidentiary objections, use the language of process to build a slow wall between the evidence and the room's emotions. The lawyer was good at it. Maggie could see the effect, the slight cooling of momentum every time he spoke, the way careful legal language had a dampening effect on rooms full of people who were moved by plain speech and uncertain in the face of technical argument. It was Ruth Henderson who stopped it. She stood up without being asked in the middle of the lawyer's third procedural objection and said, "My youngest child asked me last month why we don't have a farm anymore. She's 6 years old. I told her there was a mistake with some paperwork. She asked me whose mistake it was." Ruth looked at Hatch directly, not at his lawyer, not at the room. "I didn't have an answer for her then. I'd like to have one before she's grown." The lawyer stopped talking. Wells called the formal portion of the meeting to a close at 4 o'clock and announced that the town council would convene a special session the following morning to establish an independent land records review to be conducted by an outside auditor and overseen by 2 council members who were not Cornelius Hatch. She said it with the decisive calm of a woman who had been waiting to say something like it for 2 years and was not going to waste the moment by hedging. Hatch stood up. He looked at Wells with an expression Maggie had not seen on his face before. Not anger, not calculation, but something closer to the look her father had worn the morning the bankmen came. The look of a man who had organized his entire understanding of how the world worked around a particular set of certainties, and who was feeling those certainties move under his feet. "You'll regret this, Margaret," he said, quietly without theater, which made it worse. "I've been regretting things in this town for years," Wells said. "At least now I'll be regretting the right ones." He left with his lawyer, and Duval trailing behind him, and the room let out a collective breath that had been held. Maggie thought for considerably longer than one afternoon. She was still standing at the front of the room when Dorothy appeared at her elbow with coffee and the particular expression of a woman who was not going to let relief become complacency. "He's going to move tonight," Dorothy said low and direct. "He's embarrassed in front of this town. Men like him don't absorb that. They convert it." "Into what?" "Into action that happens in the dark, where the meeting can't see it." Dorothy looked toward the door where Hatch had exited. "He's not finished. He's reorganizing." Caleb was beside her. He had heard Dorothy's assessment, and his jaw had tightened in the way it did when he was running through scenarios he didn't like the look of. "She's right," he said. "The meeting moved people, but it didn't remove his options. He still has Duval. He still has 2 council votes. He still has Cole and Trace." He looked at Maggie. "The documents. Where are the originals right now?" "Under my coat." "They can't stay there." He said it without ceremony. "If Duval finds any reason to bring you in tonight, he'll take everything you're carrying and it will disappear before morning. We need the originals somewhere he can't reach without due process." A pause. "The church. Reverend Ames. He won't be moved by money or pressure. Hatch has never been able to get to him because Ames genuinely doesn't want anything Hatch has to offer, which makes him immune to the usual tools." Caleb looked at Dorothy. "Can you take her?" "I'll take her now," Dorothy said. The Reverend was a small, dry-voiced man who listened to everything Maggie told him without expression, and then asked one question. "Are these documents the truth?" "Yes," Maggie said. "Then I'll keep them." He took the packet without further comment and placed it in the cedar box he used for important documents and locked it with a key he wore on a chain around his neck. "I'll tell you something, Miss Aldrin. 3 families in this congregation lost land to Hatch's bank in the past 2 years. I buried one of the husbands last spring. The official cause was influenza. But I've been doing this work long enough to know what grief does to a body when a man has nothing left to protect." He looked at the locked box. "Do what you have to do." She and Dorothy were back on the main street by 5 o'clock. The snow had eased, but the cold had not, and the street had the particular emptiness of a town that had witnessed something significant and was now indoors processing it. Lamps were lit in windows along the main row. The sheriff's office showed a light. Hatch's bank was dark. Caleb was waiting outside Dorothy's cafe with a look that said something had happened in the time they had been at the church. "Trace," he said when they reached him. "He came to my ranch this afternoon while I was here, spoke to my foreman, told him that I had made a serious mistake aligning myself with an outside agitator who was going to be on the morning train one way or another, and that anyone who worked for me would be remembered for the choice they made today. Maggie heard the specific controlled anger in his voice, not hot anger, the cold kind which was more dangerous because it didn't spend itself quickly. "Your foreman," she said. "Is he—" "He told Trace to get off the property." A brief pause. "His name is Hector Garza. He's worked my ranch for 4 years. His family came from Sonora, and Hatch's bank refused them a building loan twice." He looked at Maggie. He said, "Tell Miss Aldrin we're not going anywhere." Something moved in Maggie's chest, warm and sudden, and slightly inconvenient, given everything else that was happening. She absorbed it and kept her voice steady. "Hatch is targeting your people to get to you," she said. "I know. That's my fault." "No," Caleb said with a precision that closed the topic. "That's Hatch's fault. Stop doing what he wants you to do, which is spend your energy on guilt instead of the problem." He held the door open. "Come inside. We need to plan for tonight." The three of them sat at Dorothy's kitchen table for the second night running, and this time there was a fourth person, Margaret Wells, who arrived at 6 o'clock with the council resolution from the afternoon's special session already drafted in her careful handwriting, and a look that said she had not come to discuss whether this was the right course of action. "He's going to challenge the council session procedurally," she said, spreading the document on the table. "His lawyer will file an injunction first thing tomorrow, arguing that the session was improperly convened. It won't succeed, but it will create delay, and delay is what he's buying." She looked at Maggie. "How long until the marshals can reach Cheyenne from the passes?" Caleb said 4 days if the conditions don't worsen. "They're going to worsen," Dorothy said. "I can feel it in my hands. 3 days of heavy snow coming, maybe more." Wells absorbed this without reaction. "Then we're looking at a week minimum before federal authority arrives, which means Hatch has a week to work with." She folded her hands on the table. "He's going to go after the witnesses. Not directly, he's too experienced for that. He'll use economic pressure. Loans called in, contracts canceled, the kind of slow financial suffocation that doesn't look like intimidation, but achieves the same result. He can't call in all 43 families' situations simultaneously," Maggie said. "He doesn't have the liquid capital. His actual financial position based on the secondary ledger is significantly more precarious than he presents publicly. The silver speculation venture he's been using the stolen land as collateral for, it hasn't performed. He's over-leveraged, and he knows it." She paused. "That's the other reason he needs to discredit these documents. Not just to avoid legal consequences. Because if the investment community in this territory learns the true state of his accounts, his entire financial operation collapses." The table was quiet for a moment as that settled. "He's not just protecting himself from prison," Caleb said slowly. "He's protecting himself from bankruptcy. Both at the same time, which means he's more desperate than he looks." She looked at Wells. "Which also means the injunction is not his primary play. It's a delaying tactic while he works on something else." "What's something else?" Dorothy asked. Maggie had been turning this over since the meeting ended. She had been working backward from Hatch's behavior, the measured composure at the meeting the lawyer brought in, the message sent to Caleb's ranch through Trace, all of it patient and deliberate, and pointing toward a man who was not panicking, but was definitely reorganizing. A man who had run a fraudulent operation for 3 years without being caught was not a man who made impulsive decisions under pressure. He was a man who found new angles. "He's going to try to remove the documents from the church," she said. The table went still. "Ames won't give them up," Caleb said. "He won't be asked to give them up. Hatch will manufacture a reason to access them, a legal order, a council motion, something that looks procedurally legitimate and moves fast enough that Ames doesn't have time to resist it before it's done." She looked at Wells. "Can he get a council motion passed tomorrow?" "With 2 reliable votes and the procedural argument his lawyer files tonight, possibly." Wells's expression was the expression of a woman doing an honest calculation she didn't like the result of. If he calls an emergency session, before I can convene the regular one, he controls the agenda. Then we need to make sure he can't call an emergency session, Caleb said. How? By making sure there's already a larger legal authority in play before his lawyer files anything. He looked at Maggie. You said the telegraph message you sent to the marshal's office was short and specific. How specific? Specific enough to establish that evidence existed and was in possession of a named individual. Not specific enough to protect that individual if circumstances change. Can we send a second message tonight with enough detail that the marshal's office has to treat it as an active complaint requiring immediate response, not something to investigate when the pass is clear, but something to respond to now? They can't get here faster than the weather allows. No, but they can send written confirmation of receipt back to Peter Calloway's office, a federal acknowledgement that the complaint is under active review. Once that exists, any action Hatch takes against the evidence or against you becomes obstruction of a federal investigation. He looked at her steadily. It changes his legal exposure, significantly. Maggie saw it immediately. It boxes him in, she said. He can still apply local pressure, but every action he takes from that moment forward is potentially a federal charge rather than a local one. She was already thinking through the message. I need to be precise. The language has to be specific enough to trigger active review status, but not so technical that the operator misunderstands it. Write it, Wells said. I'll go with you to Calloway's office. My presence as council chair makes it harder for Duval to intervene without it looking exactly like what it is. I'll ride cover, Caleb said. It was not a dramatic statement. It was the practical statement of a man who had assessed the situation and identified the physical risk, and was accounting for it without being asked. Maggie looked at him. In the lamplight of Dorothy's kitchen, with the snow starting up again outside, and Cornelius Hatch reorganizing somewhere across this frozen town, Caleb Dunmore looked like what he was, a man who had spent 2 years standing still and was finding his footing again carefully, one decision at a time, the way you find footing on uncertain ground. He looked like someone she trusted, which was not a small thing, and which she had not trusted herself to feel until this moment. She did not say any of that. She picked up a pen and pulled a blank sheet of paper toward her and began writing the telegraph message. They went to Calloway's at 8 o'clock, the four of them, Maggie and Wells, walking together. Dorothy remaining at the cafe, Caleb 20 feet behind them, on the street, in the way of someone who was not exactly an escort, but was exactly present. The snow was coming down, the way Dorothy had predicted, committed now accumulating. Calloway read the message, made 2 small technical adjustments to the phrasing, and sent it at 8:22. He wrote the transmission time and the confirmation number on a separate paper and handed it to Maggie. And the look on his face was the look of a man who had been wanting to do something useful for a long time and had finally found the right instrument. They were halfway back to the cafe when Denny Cole stepped out from between 2 buildings. He was not alone. Trace was with him, tall hat on indoors, and out, as Caleb had said, with the patient quality of a man who had done this kind of work before and had learned that patience was more effective than aggression. They blocked the sidewalk in the way that was designed to look accidental to anyone watching from a window. Maggie felt Wells tense beside her. She felt her own pulse spike, and then, with a deliberate effort, steady. She had been in rooms with men who used their physical presence as a weapon since she was 23 years old. She understood the mechanics of it. Evening, Cole said. He looked at Maggie. Mr. Hatch was hoping you might have time for a private conversation. Miss Aldrin has no interest in a private conversation with Mr. Hatch, Wells said. Her voice was the voice of a woman who had been running a hardware store and a council seat for 4 years and was not going to be blocked on a public sidewalk by hired muscle without noting it precisely. And you are obstructing a public thoroughfare, Mr. Cole, which I will note in my written report to the Territorial Council tomorrow morning. Cole looked at Wells with the assessing look of a man deciding how much a particular obstacle cost. He looked at Caleb, who had come up behind them in the quiet way of someone who had been moving toward this moment since they left the telegraph office, The two men held each other's attention for a moment that had a specific quality to it. Not the theatrical tension of men about to fight, but the practical accounting of men who were both experienced enough to know whether a thing was worth the cost. "Tell Mr. Hatch," Maggie said, "that any communication he wishes to make should be directed to Margaret Wells in her capacity as council chair, or to the Federal Marshal's office in Cheyenne, which as of 8:22 this evening is actively reviewing a formal complaint." She paused. "Good night, Mr. Cole." She walked forward. Wells walked with her. Cole and Trace did not move immediately, and then they did, stepping aside with the specific reluctance of men following orders that had just become more complicated than they had been this morning. Caleb fell into step beside Maggie as they passed close enough that their arms touched briefly, and he said nothing at all, and neither did she, and it was somehow more solid than anything either of them could have said. Dorothy had coffee ready when they came in. She looked at their faces and read them with her habitual precision and said only, "Everyone all right?" "Yes," Maggie said. "Good." Dorothy set the cups down. "Because I have something to tell you that I should have told you this morning. When I was at the Bautista farm, Rosa told me something she didn't put in the written statement. She didn't put it in because she was afraid to have it on paper." Dorothy sat down and folded her hands on the table with the deliberateness of a woman choosing her words carefully. "She told me that the week before Gerald Foss died, the accountant Hatch hired before you, the one whose death opened the position, Foss came to Luis Bautista's farm. At night, he told Luis he had found something in the bank's accounts that he couldn't sign his name to. He said he was going to Cheyenne the following week to report it to the territorial authority." Dorothy stopped. The kitchen was very quiet. "Gerald Foss died of a heart attack," Caleb said slowly. "That's what the death certificate says." Dorothy looked at Maggie. "He was 41 years old, and he had no prior history of illness. And the week before he died, he told Luis Bautista he had found exactly what you found." She held Maggie's gaze. "I'm not telling you this to frighten you. I'm telling you this because you need to understand what you are actually dealing with." Maggie sat with that for a long moment. She thought about Gerald Foss at 41 sitting across from a frightened rancher at night, telling him about numbers that didn't add up. She thought about the 43 families. She thought about her father at his kitchen table with a piece of paper in his hands. She thought about the telegraph confirmation in her coat pocket, the documents locked in Reverend Ames's cedar box, the message already traveling toward Cheyenne through copper wire and winter dark. She looked at Caleb. He was looking at her with that expression, the one she had finally named sometime in the past 2 days, as the expression of a man who had decided that what was in front of him was worth more than the safety of standing back from it. "Then we don't give him a week," she said. "We move everything we have tomorrow, all of it, publicly, fast enough that whatever he's planning doesn't have room to breathe." She straightened. "Margaret, is there anyone on the territorial judge's circuit who could be reached before the passes close completely? Someone who could issue a preservation order on the evidence before Hatch's injunction goes through?" Wells thought for a moment. "Judge Harmon in Casper. He's 2 days out, but he has a reputation for—" She paused. "He's honest. Can we reach him by telegraph?" "His clerk is in Casper, yes." "Then that's first thing tomorrow." Maggie looked around the table at the people who had been awake for the better part of 2 days, working in the cold and the snow on something that had cost each of them differently and was going to cost more before it was finished. "I want to say something," she said. "All of you. I came to Harlan Creek as a stranger with a job and a ledger and a history that made me look at numbers the way other people look at faces. I didn't come here to make a stand. I came here to do work." She stopped. "But this is the work. This has always been the work. And I am not going to let Gerald Foss's death, or my father's, or the 43 families who wrote letters that no one answered, I am not going to let any of that be the end of the story." She looked at each of them in turn. "Tomorrow we finish this." No one said anything for a moment. Then Dorothy stood up and began clearing the cups with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had decided that the most useful thing she could do was make sure everyone had eaten, and Caleb reached across the table and picked up the telegraph confirmation and read it once more with careful attention, as if the act of reading it again made it more true. And Ruth Henderson's voice came back to Maggie from that afternoon, 4 short sentences from a woman who had been carrying a question for 18 months, and Maggie thought, as she had not allowed herself to think clearly until now, tomorrow, we give her the answer. The morning came in gray and heavy, the kind of Wyoming winter morning that pressed down on everything beneath it with an indifferent weight. Maggie was awake before the light, sitting at Dorothy's kitchen table, with the telegraph confirmation in front of her, and the particular stillness of someone who had finished planning and was now simply waiting for the day to begin. Dorothy came in at 5:30 and put coffee on without speaking. Caleb arrived at 6 with his ranch foreman Hector Garza and 2 other men from the property, not armed or not visibly, but present in the specific way of people who had made a decision about where they stood and wanted it to be seen. Hector Garza shook Maggie's hand with both of his and said nothing beyond good morning, which was enough. Margaret Wells sent a message through Peter Calloway before 7 o'clock. Judge Harmon's clerk in Casper had received their telegraph and was forwarding the preservation order request to the judge directly. Response expected by noon. It was not certainty, but it was the shape of certainty, and Maggie held it the way you hold something fragile in cold weather, carefully, with full attention. What none of them had anticipated was Raymond Pierce. He appeared at Dorothy's door at 7:15 with the feed store's account ledger under his arm and an expression of a man who had been up all night doing something he should have done 2 years ago. He set the ledger on the table and opened it to a page he had marked with a strip of brown paper. "I've been doing business with Hatch's Bank for 11 years, he said. "I kept my own records of every transaction, every payment, every interest calculation, every fee." He pointed to a column of figures. "He's been overcharging me on my business loan interest for 7 years. Small amounts, never enough in any single month to make a man hire a lawyer, but compounded over 7 years. He tapped the bottom of the column. "It comes to $462, and I am not the only merchant in this town he's done this to." Maggie looked at the figures. They were precise and clearly kept the records of a man who had learned not to trust what he was told and had spent years quietly proving himself right. "How many other merchants?" "I spoke to 6 last night. All of them have the same pattern. Small overcharges across years of transactions. None of them ever said anything because none of them could prove it individually." He looked at her. "Together, it's a different number." It changed the geometry of what they were doing. The land fraud was the center of the case, the 43 families, the forged signatures, the human cost of what Hatch had built. But the merchant overcharges were something else, evidence that reached into every commercial relationship in Harlan Creek, that touched people who had not lost land and had not been personally destroyed, but who had been quietly robbed over years in amounts small enough to go unnoticed. It made Hatch's operation not an isolated scheme, but a systemic one, woven into the ordinary fabric of commerce in this town. "I need a list of the 6 merchants," Maggie said, "and I need their records." "They're coming here at 8 o'clock, Pierce said simply. They came. A woman who ran the dry goods store with her daughter. The man who owned the livery stable. 2 ranchers who bought feed on credit. A miller from the east edge of town who drove 20 minutes through the snow to set his ledger on Dorothy's table. They came in and sat down and showed their numbers with the specific relief of people who had been carrying a private wrong for years and had finally found somewhere to put it. Maggie worked through every ledger with the focused speed of 15 years of professional practice. She translated each one into plain language, adding the figures to the growing document she was building. Not just the land fraud now, but the full portrait of what Cornelius Hatch had been doing in Harlan Creek for 15 years. By 9:30, she had a 12-page summary that constituted the clearest financial crime case she had ever assembled in her professional life and she had assembled it in a cafe kitchen in a Wyoming blizzard with borrowed paper and a borrowed pen. She looked at what she had built and felt for the first time since she had thrown that ledger on Hatch's desk 3 days ago, something that was not urgency or strategy or the controlled management of fear. She felt certain. Not the brittle certainty of someone who hoped they were right, but the solid certainty of someone who had counted every number twice and knew what they added up to. "It's enough," she said aloud. Caleb looked up from the chair where he had been watching her work. "Enough for what?" "Enough for everything." She set the pen down. "The land fraud establishes criminal intent. The merchant overcharges establish pattern and duration. Together they demonstrate a systematic operation across 15 years affecting not 43 families, but this entire town." She looked at him. No jury in any territory is going to look at this and find reasonable doubt. He looked at the 12 pages. Then he looked at her with that expression, the one that had started as something she couldn't name, and had become over 3 days something she could name perfectly well, and had been careful not to say out loud. "You came here to replace an accountant and sign some quarterly statements," he said. "That's what I was hired to do. And instead you—" He stopped. The words seemed insufficient to him, which she understood because they were. "Instead I did the work," she said. The preservation order arrived from Judge Harmon at 11:47, transmitted through Peter Calloway's telegraph with the judge's clerk's authentication number. It was 3 paragraphs of territorial legal language that meant in plain terms that no person or institution could remove, alter, or restrict access to the evidence described in the federal complaint without authorization from the territorial court. It did not arrest Cornelius Hatch. It did not restore the Henderson land, or the Bautista acreage, or any of the 43 parcels. But it put a wall of federal authority around what Maggie had built, and it made any action Hatch took against the evidence a crime he committed in front of a judge's written record. Wells read it twice. Her expression was the expression of a woman who had been patient for 2 years and was finding patience at this particular moment extremely difficult to maintain. "I'm going to the bank," she said. "Margaret," Caleb started, "as council chair, officially, with this document." She held up the preservation order. "To inform Mr. Hatch that the council's independent review will proceed this afternoon, and that the territorial court has issued a preservation order on all relevant documents." She looked at Caleb with the steady look of a woman who did not require protection, only practical support. "I'm not going alone, but I am going." Caleb looked at Maggie. Maggie looked at the document in Wells's hand. "I'm coming with you," she said. They went 4 across Maggie, Caleb, Wells, and Hector Garza, who had positioned himself as a constant quiet presence since 6 o'clock that morning and showed no signs of repositioning. The snow was steady, but the wind had dropped, and the main street of Harlan Creek held a strange suspended quality. The quality of a place that knows something is about to be decided and is holding itself still around the fact. Hatch's bank was open. The clerk behind the counter, a young man named Willis, who had always been professionally polite to Maggie in the 3 weeks she had worked there, looked at the 4 of them coming through the door and went visibly pale. "Is Mr. Hatch in?" Wells said. Yes, ma'am, but he's with his lawyer." "Good," Wells said, and walked past the counter toward Hatch's office. He was there. His lawyer was there. And so unexpectedly was Sheriff Duvall sitting in a chair along the wall, with the look of a man who was not sure this morning whose orders he was following. The 3 of them looked at the 4 people who walked through the office door, and Hatch's lawyer started to stand, and Wells set the preservation order on the desk before he was fully upright. "Territorial Court," she said. "Issued this morning by Judge Harmon in Casper. You have been served." She did not sit down. She looked at Hatch directly. "The council's independent review convenes at 2 o'clock this afternoon. You are not required to attend, but your records are required to be available to the reviewing auditor. Interference with that process as of this morning constitutes obstruction of a federal investigation." She paused. "Do you have any questions?" Hatch looked at the preservation order. He looked at it the way her father had looked at the foreclosure notice. And Maggie felt the inversion of that moment so completely that it briefly took her breath. He looked at a piece of paper and understood what it meant. And what it meant was that the architecture he had spent 15 years constructing was document by document coming apart at its foundations. He looked at Maggie. Not at Wells, not at Caleb. At Maggie. "You understand," he said, "that this is not finished. My lawyers will challenge everything you want," Maggie said. "Challenge it in front of Judge Harmon, who is honest, and federal marshals who are coming, and 43 families whose names you forged, and the 6 merchants you overcharged for 7 years, and a town full of people who sat in Dorothy Vasquez's cafe yesterday afternoon and looked at your numbers." She held his gaze without flinching. "You built this town on what people didn't know. I built my case on what they do. That's a difference you cannot lawyer your way around." Duval shifted in his chair. He had been very still throughout the exchange, and now he stood up slowly with the look of a man crossing a threshold he had been standing on the edge of for some time. "I'll be at the 2 o'clock review," he said. To Wells, not to Hatch. "To ensure the process proceeds without interference." Hatch looked at him. The look contained everything that had passed between them over years of arrangement. The payments, the orders followed. The cases not investigated, the arrests manufactured. Duval absorbed that look and did not sit back down. "Carl," Hatch said. The word had the quality of something that had expected to be a command and arrived as something smaller. "I'm done," Duval said simply. "I should have been done 2 years ago." They left Hatch's office and walked back out through the bank past Willis at the counter, who watched them go with the expression of a young man recalibrating his professional future, and through the front door into the cold, clean air of the main street. Caleb exhaled. It was a long, controlled exhale, the kind that carries something that has been held for longer than the last few minutes. He looked at Maggie and said, "You told him everything." "I told him the truth," Maggie said. "There's a difference." Wells was already walking toward the council offices with the preservation order and the specific, purposeful stride of a woman who had a 2 o'clock meeting to prepare for. Hector Garza fell into step beside Caleb. The snow came down around them, and the town moved in its ordinary patterns. Shops opening, a wagon coming down the main street, a woman calling to someone from a second-floor window. All of it, the ordinary texture of a place that did not yet fully know it was changed. The 2 o'clock review convened on time in the council chambers with an auditor Wells had retained from the Territorial Land Office Records Division. A dry, meticulous man named Foster, who looked at Maggie's 12-page summary with the focused appreciation of someone encountering excellent work. He spent an hour with the original documents, asking questions that were precise and technical, and which Maggie answered with equal precision, and at the end of the hour, he wrote 3 sentences in his official report that constituted the clearest professional endorsement she had ever received, and that established in formal territorial record that the evidence was genuine, complete, and sufficient. Hatch did not attend. His lawyer filed 2 procedural objections in writing, and then at 4 o'clock withdrew from representation, citing a conflict of interest that Maggie suspected was the more honest phrase for the realization that this case was no longer worth the professional risk. The federal marshals arrived on the 8th day when the passes cleared enough to allow the southern route through. There were 2 of them, experienced, unhurried, with the quiet authority of men who spent their professional lives arriving in difficult places and sorting through what they found there. They spent 3 days in Harlan Creek, reading Maggie's documentation, interviewing witnesses, and taking formal statements from the merchant group that Pierce had organized. On the 4th day, they arrested Cornelius Hatch on charges that included land fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and financial crimes that the Territorial Attorney's Office subsequently expanded into a case that ran to 61 counts. Len Probst was found in Laramie in the 2nd week of January. He was, as Caleb had predicted, not a strong man, and faced with the specific arithmetic of his own exposure versus cooperation, He chose cooperation and gave a statement that confirmed every detail of the forgery operation in his own handwriting. Arthur Sims was found 3 weeks later in Cheyenne and did the same. Cornelius Hatch went to trial in April. His own secondary ledger was the prosecution's primary exhibit. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Ruth Henderson was in the courtroom when the verdict came down. Maggie was beside her. When the foreman said guilty on all primary counts, Ruth Henderson pressed both hands over her mouth and made no sound at all for a moment. And then she turned to Maggie and took her hands and held them, and still didn't say anything, because there was nothing that language did adequately at a moment like that. Frank got his land back. So did the Bautistas and the Macreadys, and 39 of the remaining 41 families. The other 2 had already sold their parcels and left the territory, and the territorial court established a restitution process that, while imperfect and slow, moved toward something that resembled justice. Dorothy Vasquez received a letter in March from the Territorial Business Licensing Board confirming that her building purchase application submitted the previous December, the week after the public meeting had been approved, and that a small business loan from the Casper Federal Credit Union, which had filled the institutional void left by Hatch's bank, had been authorized at the standard rate. She read the letter at her own kitchen table and set it down with the careful deliberateness of a woman who had learned not to celebrate before the ground was solid. Then she stood up and opened her cafe for the morning rush and served breakfast to 23 people, which was the most she had served on a Tuesday morning in 3 years. The Land Records Review that Wells oversaw through the spring identified 6 additional fraudulent filings that had not been in Maggie's original documentation. The independent auditor Foster stayed in Harlan Creek for 2 months longer than he had planned because the scope of what he found kept expanding. At the end of it, he wrote a report that was submitted to the territorial legislature and that quietly initiated reforms to land recording practices that would take years to fully implement, but would change in specific and lasting ways the conditions under which men like Hatch could operate. Maggie wrote a copy of that report with her own annotations and sent it to 3 accounting firms in St. Louis that she knew took on public interest cases. She never knew exactly what happened with it afterward, but the following year, she heard through a professional contact that a similar land fraud scheme in Dakota Territory had been exposed partly because an auditor had read a documented case from Wyoming and knew what to look for. On a Thursday evening in late May, Caleb Dunmore drove his wagon to Dorothy's cafe and asked Maggie if she wanted to ride out to the ranch and see what the spring had done to the eastern pasture. She said yes, which was not a surprise to either of them, and they drove out in the long western evening light, with the mountains ahead of them, turning colors that had no adequate name. The eastern pasture was what it always was in Wyoming in May, wide and particular and quietly extraordinary. They stood beside the wagon and looked at it for a while without saying anything, which had become over the months since December one of their most comfortable modes of being together. "I've been thinking," Caleb said. "I know." He looked at her. "I haven't said anything yet." "You've been thinking about saying something for about 3 weeks," Maggie said. "I've been waiting." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're going to make everything very difficult, aren't you? For the rest of my life?" "Probably." "Good," he said. "I've been doing easy for 2 years and it didn't suit me." He took her hand, which was not a small gesture for a man who had spent 2 years learning to be careful about what he reached for. She let him, which was not a small gesture for a woman who had spent 15 years learning to stand without leaning. They stood there in the May evening with their hands together and the mountain light coming down around them, and Harlan Creek behind them changed, and still changing the way places change when the people inside them finally decide they can. He asked her 2 weeks later formally, and somewhat awkwardly in Dorothy's cafe over coffee, which was exactly the right place for it. She said yes before he finished the sentence. Dorothy, who had been pretending to wipe down the counter 6 feet away, set down her cloth and went into the kitchen and could be heard doing something unnecessarily loud with a stack of pans. They were married in September, in the open land beside the creek the town was named for, with the aspens turning, and the sky the particular blue that Wyoming produces in fall, as if in apology for its winters. Reverend Ames conducted the ceremony. The Henderson family came. Dorothy made the wedding supper. Rosa Bautista brought flowers from her kitchen garden, late-season blooms, that she had been saving for a reason she said she'd known was coming. Margaret Wells gave a brief toast in which she said that Harlan Creek had been transformed in the past year, not by any single act of heroism, but by the accumulation of small, courageous decisions made by people who had every reason to stay quiet and chose not to. She raised her glass to the room and said that this was the only kind of change that lasted. Maggie, standing beside her husband in the last of the September light, thought about her father at his kitchen table. She thought about Gerald Foss at 41, who had found what she found and had not lived to finish what he started. She thought about 43 forged names on 43 pieces of paper and the families who had lived inside the wrong those names represented. She thought about the 12 pages she had written in Dorothy's kitchen in a blizzard, and the telegraph message that traveled through copper wire and winter dark, and a preservation order that arrived at 11:47 in the morning and changed what the afternoon was allowed to be. She thought about a woman who had come to Harlan Creek with a train ticket, a set of accounting credentials, and a history that had made her look at numbers the way other people looked at faces, with the knowledge that they could lie and the skill to prove when they did. She thought about all of it, and what she felt was not triumph, which was too bright and too brief for what this was. What she felt was the specific, durable satisfaction of work that had been done completely, work that had started in her father's kitchen 30 years ago and ended in a Wyoming courtroom in April, with 61 counts and a guilty verdict, and that had built in the space between those 2 points something that would outlast both the crime and the punishment. The woman who had come to Harlan Creek to sign quarterly statements had instead signed her name to the kind of reckoning that changes the ground people stand on, and in doing so had built the one thing that no corrupt man with a ledger full of lies had ever been able to manufacture: a life that was entirely, irrevocably, and honestly her own. Part 5. Louis viết 2.800 đến 3.000 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại, tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề. Tránh ngắt quãng, đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc chân thực và gần gũi, mô tả cảnh ít tập trung vào hành động cảm xúc. Kẻ theo ngôi thứ ba giữ độ kịch tính, không viết lăn mặn. Kết thúc dùng câu khẳng định manh để khép lại câu chuyện rõ ràng, trọn vẹn. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn, không nhảy sang mục document 1600. Orchestrated, seamless narrative continuation with emotional depth. Orchestrated, seamless narrative continuation with emotional depth. The morning of the council review arrived, the way difficult mornings do, without ceremony, without the dramatic pause that the weight of the occasion seemed to demand. Maggie was awake at 4:30, which had become habitual over the past week, in the way that sustained urgency rewires a person's sleep. She lay still in Dorothy's back room for 10 minutes, listening to the snow, and then got up because lying still had never been something she was good at when there was work left to do. She sat at the kitchen table and read through her 12-page summary one final time. Not because she doubted it, she had stopped doubting it somewhere around the third merchant's ledger the previous morning, when the pattern became so clear and so complete that doubt would have required willful blindness. She read it because she wanted to know it the way a musician knows a piece before a performance, not just the notes, but the shape of it, the weight of each section, where the argument breathed and where it pressed. Caleb came in at 5:30 and found her there. He looked at the documents, and then at her, and said nothing for a moment, which was one of the things she had come to understand about him, that he was a man who spoke when he had something to say, and was comfortable in the spaces between. He poured himself coffee and sat down across from her and said, "How are you?" It was a simple question, and she almost gave him a simple answer. Then she looked at him, at the steadiness in his face, the 2 years of standing still, and the past 4 days of moving again, and said the true thing instead. "I'm afraid," she said. Not of Hatch. Of the moment after. When it's done, and I have to figure out what comes next. He considered that with the seriousness it deserved. What came before this? He asked. Before Harlan Creek. Work, moving between cities, building cases for people I never met, and leaving before I saw how they ended. Did that suit you? It was what I knew how to do. That's not the same thing. He set his cup down. His cup. Maggie. Whatever comes after it doesn't have to be the same as what came before. He said it without weight or implication, as a plain fact about the world that he thought she might find useful. Some people leave a place when it's done with them. Some people stay because the place isn't done with them yet. He paused. I don't know which kind you are, but I think you do. She looked at him across Dorothy's kitchen table in the pre-dawn dark and understood that he was not asking her to stay. He was not asking her anything. He was simply telling her that both possibilities existed, which was itself a kind of gift, the gift of a man who understood the difference between holding a door open and blocking the one behind you. Let's finish this first, she said. Yes, he said. Let's. Dorothy arrived at 6 with the specific energy of a woman who had decided overnight that she was done being afraid and was finding the decision clarifying. She made breakfast for everyone who came through the door. Hector Garza and his 2 ranch hands, Raymond Pierce, Peter Calloway, who had closed the telegraph office for the morning and left his assistant in charge with instructions to send for him immediately if anything came through from Cheyenne. Ruth Henderson arrived at 7 with Frank beside her and the Henderson children's schoolteacher, a woman named Vera Potts, who taught the 3-room schoolhouse on the south side of town, and who had, Ruth explained quietly, been overcharged on her teacher's housing loan by Hatch's bank for 4 years and wanted to be present when the accounting was made. By 8 o'clock, Dorothy's Cafe held 15 people who had come because they had decided, each in their own time and for their own reasons, that the cost of standing in the wrong place today was higher than the cost of standing in the right one. The council review convened at 2 o'clock in the council chambers, which was a room above the hardware store that smelled like timber and old paper and the accumulated weight of decisions made in it over 12 years. Wells had arranged the space with the precise attention of a woman who understood that the physical organization of a room communicated things before anyone spoke. The auditor, Foster, sat at the central table with Maggie's documentation in front of him. The 2 council members Wells had appointed to the oversight panel, Arthur Fry, and a rancher named Louise Crane, who ran the largest cattle operation in the eastern county, sat to his left. A territorial notary sat to his right to authenticate the proceedings. Maggie sat across from Foster. Her documents were in order. Her hands were steady. Hatch came in at 2:04 with a new lawyer, a man who had ridden from Casper the previous night, and who had the rumpled, purposeful look of someone who had reviewed the case on a moving horse and had questions. He sat down beside Hatch and opened his case and began preparing objections, which was what he had been hired to do and which Maggie had accounted for. The review did not proceed the way court proceedings did. Foster was not a judge, and this was not a trial. It was a formal document examination conducted by a territorial auditor with legal standing to make binding findings, and what made it different from the afternoon meeting at Dorothy's was that here, the evidence did not have to convince a room of frightened people. It had to satisfy one meticulous professional whose entire career was built on the honest reading of numbers. Foster read. He asked questions. He asked Maggie to walk him through the sequence of the secondary ledger entries against the land transfer timeline, which she did in the precise methodical way she had explained it to the Hendersons, and then to Wells, and then to the cafe full of people, each time stripping away another layer of technical complexity until the fraud was as readable as a simple subtraction problem. He asked Hatch's lawyer to explain the payment to Probst and Sims dated October 14th. The lawyer objected on procedural grounds. Foster noted the objection and asked the question again. The lawyer conferred with Hatch in a low voice. Hatch's face during this conference was the face of a man doing arithmetic that kept coming out wrong no matter how he ran the numbers. He had been doing that arithmetic, Maggie thought, since she walked out of his office 4 days ago with the ledger under her arm. Every calculation pointed to the same result, and he had spent 4 days refusing to accept it, which was the specific failure mode of men who had been powerful long enough to believe that their refusal to accept a result changed the result. It didn't. Numbers did not negotiate. "I have no explanation for the payment," Hatch said finally. He said it quietly, without the composure that had carried him through the public meeting 2 days before. The composure was still present, but it had become effortful, visible as effort in a way it hadn't been before. The way structural damage in a building becomes visible from outside only when it has progressed too far to be hidden. Foster wrote something in his official report. The scratching of his pen in the quiet room was the loudest sound in the building. Hatch's lawyer tried 3 more objections over the following hour. Foster considered each one, noted it, and continued. He was not hostile, and he was not sympathetic. He was a man doing a specific job with specific tools, and watching him do it was for Maggie one of the most satisfying professional experiences of her life. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was exactly what it claimed to be. Honest work done correctly, producing a result that the evidence demanded. At 4:17, Foster set down his pen and looked at the room over his reading glasses with the expression of a man who had finished an accounting and was prepared to report the total. The documentation presented by Miss Aldrin constitutes a complete and internally consistent record of systematic land fraud conducted over a period of not less than 3 years. He said, in the tone of a man reading from a prepared statement that he had been composing in his head for the past 2 hours. The forgeries are demonstrably present in 31 of the 43 contracts reviewed based on handwriting analysis and documentary sequencing. The secondary ledger entries corroborate the forgery timeline and establish direct financial connection between the contracting parties and the primary account holder. He paused. I am making a finding of confirmed fraud and forwarding this report to the Territorial Attorney's Office and the Federal Marshal's Circuit with a recommendation for immediate criminal referral. He looked at Hatch directly. Mr. Hatch, these are my formal findings. You have 14 days to submit a written response through proper channels. Hatch said nothing. His lawyer closed his case and stood up and said carefully, My client will be reviewing his options. It was the language of a man who had already begun the process of professional disengagement and was leaving a verbal door open to walk through later. Duval, who had been standing along the back wall for the entire 2 hours, said, Harold Hatch, I am placing you under temporary custody, pending formal charges by the territorial attorney. He said it without theater, with the specific flatness of a man who had made a decision that had been a long time coming and was not going to dress it up. You have the right to legal representation. Your lawyer is present. I'd suggest you use him. Hatch stood up. He looked around the room at Wells, at Fry, at Louise Crane, at Maggie, at the faces of the people who had been in Dorothy's cafe 2 days ago and who were now watching from the back of the council chambers, with the quiet attention of people witnessing the conclusion of something that had been building for a long time. His expression in that moment was not the expression of a villain caught in a story. It was the expression of a man who had made a series of choices over 15 years that had seemed at each individual step like the rational choice, and who was now standing at the place all those rational choices had led him, and finding it was not where he had expected to arrive. I built this town, he said, not to anyone in particular, not as a defense, as a statement of something he seemed to genuinely believe, which made it sadder and more damning than any confession. You stole from it, Ruth Henderson said from the back of the room. Her voice was even and clear, and completely without heat, which was more devastating than anger would have been. There's a difference. My daughter knows the difference now. Duval took Hatch by the arm gently but definitively and walked him out of the room. The lawyer followed. The door closed. The room held a moment of the particular silence that follows the completion of something that has required sustained effort from many people over a long time. Not the stunned silence of surprise, but the full silence of arrival. Wells stood up and said, "The council will convene a full session Monday morning to begin the land records remediation process. Anyone with a fraudulent filing on record will be contacted by the end of next week." She said it practically already moving forward, which was the quality Maggie had most admired in her from the beginning, the quality of a woman who understood that justice was not the end of work, but the beginning of different work. Foster packed his documents methodically and shook Maggie's hand with both of his. "The cleanest case I've reviewed in 11 years, he said. "I want you to know that." "Thank you," Maggie said. "The families did the hard part. I just counted what was there." "Don't undersell counting," he said. "It's rarer than people think." The federal marshals arrived 9 days later when the passes finally cleared enough to allow passage on the southern route. By then, the territorial attorney had filed the initial charges. Probst had been located in Laramie through Caleb's contact and brought in for questioning, and the preliminary hearing date had been set. The marshals spent 3 days in Harlan Creek, reviewing the documentation, interviewing the merchant group that Pierce had organized, and taking formal statements that expanded the case in ways Maggie had anticipated but had not had time to fully document herself. They were efficient and thorough, and one of them, a weathered woman named Clara Marsh, who was the first female deputy marshal in the Wyoming circuit, read Maggie's 12-page summary, and then sat quietly for a moment and said, "Who trained you?" "My father, partly," Maggie said, "and 15 years of watching what happens to people who can't read their own contracts." Marsh nodded once. "I'm going to recommend to the territorial attorney that your documentation be entered as the primary exhibit. Not supporting material. Primary." She looked at the pages. "This is what accountability looks like when it's done right." Hatch went to trial in April in the territorial court in Cheyenne. Maggie testified for 3 hours on the second day, walking the jury through the documentary evidence with the same plain translated precision she had used in Dorothy's kitchen and the council chambers, and everywhere else the evidence had needed to be explained. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and returned guilty on the primary counts of land fraud, forgery, and conspiracy, with additional findings on the financial crimes charges that the territorial attorney had added in March. The sentencing followed in June, 12 years in the territorial prison, with a civil judgment that resulted in the liquidation of his remaining assets toward restitution for the affected families. It was not everything. The 2 families who had already left the territory received their restitution payments months late, after a process that required them to navigate a bureaucratic complexity that was exhausting and expensive, and that Maggie spent 3 evenings helping them work through by correspondence. 3 of the merchant overcharge cases were dismissed on technical grounds that frustrated Pierce enormously, and which Maggie privately thought were correct legal decisions, even if they produced an unjust outcome. The land recording reforms that Wells had initiated moved through the territorial legislature, slowly amended and delayed, and partially gutted by interests that Hatch's prosecution had not touched. And the version that finally passed was a fraction of what Wells had proposed. That was the nature of this work. Maggie had known it from the beginning, from the first time she had built a case in Street Lewis at 23, and watched it produce a partial result, and had to sit with the specific discomfort of partial results, which looked like failure from the outside and felt like something more complicated from the inside. She had learned to hold both things at once, the satisfaction of what had been accomplished, and the clear-eyed accounting of what hadn't. They were not in competition. They were both true. The Hendersons got their land back in May. The legal transfer was completed on a Tuesday morning, and Maggie was not present for it because by then she had enough work to fill 3 of her that the remediation process had generated, and she was at Dorothy's kitchen table working through a filing for the Bautistas. But Ruth sent her a note that arrived the same afternoon, written in the careful handwriting of a woman who chose her words deliberately. It said, "She asked me again this morning. I told her what happened. She said, 'That's good.' She went outside to play. That's all. That's everything." Maggie kept the note. The thing with Caleb did not announce itself dramatically. It accumulated the way Wyoming weather accumulated, slowly, consistently, until you looked up one day and it had become the entire sky. He rode into town most evenings that spring, not always with a purpose, sometimes just to sit on the steps of Dorothy's cafe, while Maggie worked through her correspondence at the table inside, with the door propped open so the late-day air came through. He did not hover, and he did not press. He was simply present in the way that some people were present quietly, substantively, in a manner that the space around them registered. In April, he brought her a ledger he had found in his father's effects and old accounts book from the ranch's early years that had some irregular entries he couldn't make sense of. She looked at it and explained what she found, and they spent 2 hours at the table working through the figures together, and at the end of it, he looked at what they had built side by side on the paper and said, "You're good at this." "I know," she said. "I don't mean the accounting." He looked at her directly. "I mean working with someone. Most people who are very good at something alone are not very good at it with another person in the room. You're good at both." She looked at him for a moment. "You've been thinking about how to say that for a while." "About 3 weeks," he admitted. "I know," she said again, and smiled, and it was the first time in the months she had known him that she felt the smile reach all the way through her. Not the controlled professional expression she had deployed in difficult rooms, but the real one. The one her father used to say made her look exactly like herself. He asked her formally in May in the open air beside the creek the town was named for, with the mountains showing the last of their snow, and the cottonwoods running green along the water. He was not elegant about it, and he did not pretend to be. He said that he had spent 2 years learning to stand still, and the past 5 months learning to move again, and that she was the reason for both, and that he wanted to spend the rest of his life in the same direction she was going. Because that direction was the only one that felt worth the ground it covered. She said yes before he finished, which he later said was characteristic, and she said was efficient, and they both agreed it was exactly right. They married in September in the open land beside the creek with the aspens turned gold, and the sky the hard, clean blue that Wyoming produced in fall. Reverend Ames spoke plainly and briefly, which was how everyone who knew either of them had hoped he would. Dorothy served supper afterward in the cafe she now owned outright, whose building loan from the new Territorial Credit Union had been approved at the standard rate without condition or delay, because the man who would have denied it was in a prison in Cheyenne. Rosa Bautista brought flowers from her kitchen garden. Ruth and Frank Henderson came with all 4 children, the youngest of whom had apparently decided that the occasion called for a serious examination of every piece of furniture in Dorothy's cafe, and spent the reception conducting one. Peter Calloway raised a toast that was mostly about the telegraph service and entirely about courage, which was exactly the right way to honor what had happened in this town. Margaret Wells danced with Raymond Pierce to a fiddle played by one of Caleb's ranch hands, and Raymond Pierce danced with more grace than anyone had expected of him, and Dorothy watched from behind the counter with the expression of a woman who had fed this town through hard times and good ones, and was finding the good ones this particular evening extraordinarily nourishing. Maggie stood in the middle of it all, in the middle of Dorothy's cafe, in the middle of Harlan Creek, in the middle of a life that had taken 4 days in December, and a Wyoming blizzard, and 43 forged names on 43 pieces of paper to become fully, finally, and irrevocably her own. And she looked at her husband across the room. He was talking to Hector Garza with the relaxed attention of a man who was entirely at home in the place he was standing, and he looked up at the same moment she looked over, which had been happening with increasing frequency since January, and which neither of them had ever once commented on. She thought about the train she had arrived on 3 weeks before she threw a ledger on a dishonest man's desk. She thought about her father at his kitchen table, turning a piece of paper over and over in his hands, not yet understanding that it was not a mistake. She thought about Gerald Foss at 41, who had found the truth and had not lived to carry it forward, and whose unfinished work she had finished. She thought about 43 families whose names had been written without their knowledge on documents that took everything they had built, and who had spent years being told the paperwork was in order. She thought about what it meant to spend your life learning to read the lies that numbers told when the people writing them believed no one was paying close enough attention. And she understood, standing in the warm light of Dorothy Vasquez's cafe on a September evening, with the mountains outside and the fiddle playing, and her husband looking across the room at her with the specific expression of a man who had stopped being careful about what he reached for. She understood that this was not the end of the work. There would be other towns, other ledgers, other families with letters that nobody answered. There would always be men who believed that what people didn't know couldn't hurt them. And there would always be the specific, durable, consequential work of proving them wrong. But tonight was tonight. Tonight was Dorothy's cafe, and September light, and a husband who understood that her work was not something to manage around, but something to stand beside. Tonight was Ruth Henderson's daughter asking a question and finally getting an honest answer. Tonight was 43 families beginning the long process of getting back what had been taken from them. Because one woman had come to Harlan Creek with an accounting certificate and a history that had made her refuse to look away from numbers that didn't add up. Caleb crossed the room to her. He didn't say anything. He took her hand and held it, and she let him, and outside the September mountains stood exactly as they always had, patient, enormous, indifferent to the human business conducted at their feet, and entirely unchanged by it. But the town at their base was different now. And the woman standing in it was exactly who she had always been working to become. The ledger had been balanced, and the truth had been entered in ink that did not fade.